Among the 20 Primarchs scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, few endured a childhood as brutal and formative as Corvus Corax. While his brothers landed on worlds that would shape them into conquerors, kings, or warriors, the infant who would become the Raven Lord found himself cast into the depths of Deliverance, a moon orbiting the world of Kievar in the Segmentum Solar. This harsh environment would forge him into something unique among the Emperor's sons, a liberator born from oppression, a master of shadow warfare shaped by necessity rather than noble tradition. Deliverance presented a landscape of perpetual twilight, its surface scarred by massive industrial complexes and mining operations that had stripped away much of the moon's natural beauty. The atmosphere hung thick with the acrid smoke of countless factories, while the pale light of Kievar's sun filtered weakly through the polluted skies. Beneath this desolate surface lay an extensive network of tunnels, mines, and underground facilities where the bulk of the moon's population toiled in conditions that bordered on slavery. The Tech Guild overlords who controlled Deliverance had established a rigid caste system that divided society into distinct layers. At the apex sat the Tech Guilds themselves, wealthy merchant families who had accumulated power through their control of manufacturing and trade. These overlords lived in towering spires that pierced the moon's surface, enjoying luxuries imported from across the sector while remaining completely isolated from the suffering below. Beneath them served a middle class of technicians, overseers, and skilled workers who maintained the complex machinery that kept production flowing. At the bottom of this hierarchy existed the masses of workers, prisoners, and slaves who performed the dangerous manual labor in the deepest mines and most hazardous manufacturing facilities. When the infant Primarch's gestation pod crashed into Deliverance's surface, it was quickly discovered by a work gang operating in the outer mining sectors. The workers, led by a man named Lycaeus, recognized immediately that this was no ordinary child. Even as an infant, the future Corvus Corax displayed the enhanced physiology common to all Primarchs: accelerated growth, remarkable resilience, and an intelligence that manifested far earlier than any normal human child. Rather than report their discovery to the Tech Guild authorities, Lycaeus and his fellow workers made a decision that would alter the course of history. They chose to hide the child among their own ranks, raising him as one of the downtrodden masses rather than allowing him to fall into the hands of their oppressors. The underground communities of Deliverance operated according to their own harsh rules of survival. Resources were scarce, surveillance was constant, and the punishment for any form of resistance was swift and brutal. The Tech Guilds maintained their control through a combination of technological superiority and systematic oppression. Advanced monitoring systems tracked worker movements throughout the tunnel networks, while armed overseers enforced quotas and discipline with casual violence. The workers themselves were kept deliberately weakened through inadequate nutrition and exhausting labor schedules that left little energy for organized resistance. Growing up in this environment, the young Primarch absorbed lessons that would define his approach to warfare and leadership for the rest of his existence. He learned to move silently through the cramped tunnels, avoiding the attention of overseers and surveillance equipment. The constant need for stealth became second nature to him, as did the ability to read the subtle signs that indicated when danger approached. His enhanced senses allowed him to detect the approach of guards long before normal humans could perceive any threat, while his growing physical capabilities enabled him to navigate the treacherous mining tunnels with an agility that seemed almost supernatural to his adoptive family. The harsh conditions of Deliverance's underground facilities would have broken most individuals, but they served to strengthen and focus the Primarch's developing abilities. The perpetual darkness of the deep mines enhanced his natural night vision, while the need to work in cramped, dangerous spaces honed his spatial awareness and reflexes. His body adapted to the low oxygen environment of the deeper tunnels, developing an efficiency that would later prove invaluable in combat situations. More importantly, the constant exposure to injustice and oppression awakened something fundamental in his nature, a burning hatred for tyranny that would drive him to acts of liberation across the galaxy. As he matured at the accelerated rate typical of Primarchs, Corvus Corax began to display tactical insights that far exceeded his apparent age and experience. He studied the patterns of guard rotations, memorized the layouts of security systems, and analyzed the weaknesses in the Tech Guild's control mechanisms. His fellow workers began to notice his unusual abilities, but rather than fear or suspicion, they felt hope. Here was someone who might possess the capability to challenge their oppressors in ways they had never dared imagine. The Primarch's first acts of rebellion were small but significant. He began by sabotaging equipment in ways that appeared accidental, causing production delays that frustrated the overseers without providing clear evidence of deliberate interference. He learned to move through the ventilation systems and maintenance tunnels, gathering intelligence about guard positions and security protocols. His enhanced hearing allowed him to eavesdrop on conversations between Tech Guild representatives, providing valuable information about their plans and vulnerabilities. These early acts of resistance revealed another crucial aspect of Corvus Corax's developing character, his ability to inspire others without exposing them to unnecessary risk. He never asked his fellow workers to take actions beyond their capabilities, instead focusing on building a network of trusted individuals who could provide support and information. His natural charisma, enhanced by his Primarch heritage, allowed him to communicate his vision of liberation without triggering the suspicion of the surveillance systems that monitored the worker populations. The turning point came when Corvus Corax witnessed a particularly brutal example of Tech Guild oppression. A group of workers had been caught attempting to organize a protest over reduced food rations, and the overseers responded with characteristic violence. The Primarch watched from the shadows as men and women who had shown him kindness were beaten and dragged away to face punishment that would likely prove fatal. In that moment, his transformation from hidden refugee to active revolutionary became complete. The guerrilla campaign that followed demonstrated tactical brilliance that would have impressed even the most experienced military commanders. Corvus Corax understood instinctively that direct confrontation with the Tech Guild's superior technology and firepower would result in massacre. Instead, he developed a strategy based on stealth, misdirection, and psychological warfare that exploited every weakness in the oppressive system. His forces struck at supply convoys moving through the tunnel networks, targeting the shipments of food and equipment that kept the mining operations functioning. They sabotaged critical machinery in ways that caused maximum disruption while minimizing the risk of retaliation against innocent workers. The Primarch's enhanced physical capabilities proved crucial in these operations. His strength allowed him to move through areas that would have been inaccessible to normal humans, while his speed enabled him to strike and withdraw before security forces could respond effectively. His night vision and enhanced senses made him nearly invisible in the perpetual darkness of the underground facilities, earning him the nickname that would eventually become his formal title, the Raven Lord, a figure who appeared from the shadows to strike at the heart of tyranny. As the rebellion gained momentum, Corvus Corax demonstrated another crucial leadership quality, the ability to unite disparate groups under a common cause. The worker populations of Deliverance included individuals from dozens of different worlds and cultures, many of whom had been transported to the moon as prisoners or indentured servants. Traditional tribal and planetary loyalties often created friction within the oppressed communities, but the Primarch's vision of liberation transcended these divisions. He spoke to the fundamental human desire for freedom and dignity, creating a revolutionary movement that drew strength from diversity rather than being weakened by it. The Tech Guild's response to the growing rebellion revealed both their strength and their fundamental weakness. Their technological advantages allowed them to deploy increasingly sophisticated surveillance and security measures, including automated defense systems and enhanced monitoring capabilities. However, their complete isolation from the worker populations meant they possessed little understanding of the social dynamics that drove the resistance movement. They attempted to suppress the rebellion through increasingly harsh punishments and restrictions, but these measures only served to strengthen the resolve of the revolutionaries and drive more workers into the ranks of the resistance. Corvus Corax's tactical evolution during this period laid the foundation for the doctrines that would later define the 19th Legion. He developed techniques for rapid deployment and extraction that allowed small groups of fighters to strike at targets throughout the tunnel networks before disappearing back into the general population. His forces learned to use the industrial infrastructure of deliverance against its masters, turning the very systems designed to maintain oppression into weapons of liberation. Manufacturing equipment was repurposed to create improvised weapons and communication devices, while the transportation networks that moved resources through the moon became highways for revolutionary forces. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical effects. The tech guilds had maintained their control through the perception of invincibility, convincing the worker populations that resistance was futile and that their technological superiority made rebellion impossible. Corvus Corax's successful strikes shattered this illusion, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated security systems could be defeated by determination, intelligence, and superior tactics. Each successful operation inspired others to join the cause, creating a cascade effect that rapidly expanded the scope and effectiveness of the revolutionary movement. During this period of intense conflict, the Primarch also began to develop the philosophical framework that would guide his actions throughout his later service to the Imperium. His experiences on deliverance taught him that true strength came not from technological superiority or brute force, but from the willingness to fight for principles that transcended individual survival. He learned to see warfare not as an end in itself, but as a tool for achieving justice and protecting those who could not protect themselves. These lessons would later influence his approach to the Great Crusade, where he would consistently advocate for the protection of human populations and the establishment of just governance in newly conquered territories. The rebellion's success created a new challenge for Corvus Corax, the need to transition from guerrilla warfare to the establishment of stable governance. As tech guild control crumbled in sector after sector of Deliverance's underground facilities, the Primarch found himself responsible for organizing civilian populations and maintaining essential services. His natural administrative abilities, enhanced by his Primarch heritage, allowed him to create efficient systems for food distribution, medical care, and security that replaced the oppressive structures of the old regime. However, the ultimate resolution of Deliverance's liberation would come not from internal revolution alone, but from the arrival of an figure whose importance would dwarf even the dramatic events of the Moon's rebellion. The industrial hellscape of Deliverance operated on a foundation of systematic brutality that permeated every aspect of daily existence. Within the sprawling network of prison factories that honeycombed the Moon's surface and depths, the tech guilds had perfected a system of oppression that extracted maximum productivity while maintaining absolute control over the worker populations. The massive manufacturing complexes stretched for kilometers underground, their corridors lit by the harsh glare of industrial lighting that cast deep shadows between towering machinery. The air hung thick with metallic dust and chemical vapors that burned the lungs and left a permanent taste of copper and oil in the mouth of anyone unfortunate enough to breathe it for extended periods. The caste system imposed by the Kievaran overlords divided the population into rigidly defined categories, each marked by distinctive clothing, identification markers, and access privileges that determined every aspect of an individual's existence. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the tech guild masters themselves, identifiable by their elaborate robes embedded with circuitry patterns and their augmetic enhancements that marked their status as technological aristocrats. These overlords rarely ventured into the production areas, instead monitoring operations from climate-controlled command centers equipped with advanced surveillance systems that could track individual workers throughout the facility networks. Beneath the guild masters operated a class of technical overseers who wore reinforced leather aprons over their standard-issue uniforms, their bodies bearing the scars and chemical burns that marked years of exposure to industrial hazards. These individuals possessed sufficient technical knowledge to maintain the complex machinery that drove production, but lacked the political connections necessary to advance within the guild hierarchy. Their position made them particularly vicious in their treatment of the lower castes, as they understood that any sign of weakness or sympathy for the workers could result in their own demotion to the ranks of the oppressed. The worker populations themselves were subdivided into multiple categories based on their assigned functions and perceived reliability. Skilled technicians wore gray coveralls marked with colored strips that indicated their specialization and security clearance level. These individuals maintained the delicate balance between collaboration and resistance, possessing enough technical knowledge to potentially sabotage operations, but also enjoying marginally better living conditions that made open rebellion a dangerous gamble. General laborers were distinguished by their brown work clothes and the metal identification tags that tracked their movements throughout the facility complexes. At the bottom of the hierarchy existed the penal workers, marked by their orange jumpsuits and the heavy shackles that limited their mobility while they performed the most dangerous tasks in the deepest mining shafts. The prison factories themselves represented marvels of oppressive engineering, designed to maximize both productivity and control while minimizing the possibility of organized resistance. The main production floors stretched across vast underground caverns, their ceilings supported by massive pillars that housed surveillance equipment and automated defense systems. Assembly lines snaked through these spaces in complex patterns that prevented workers from gathering in large groups while maintaining the flow of materials and components necessary for continuous production. The machinery itself was deliberately designed to require constant human attention, preventing workers from developing the idle time necessary for planning resistance activities. Living quarters for the worker populations consisted of cramped dormitories carved directly into the rock walls of the underground complexes. These spaces housed dozens of individuals in conditions that barely met the minimum requirements for human survival. Sleeping areas were marked by thin mattresses arranged in triple-stacked bunks that left insufficient space for occupants to sit upright. Personal possessions were limited to a single small container that could be searched at any time by security personnel. The dormitories were kept deliberately overcrowded to prevent the formation of private spaces where resistance activities might be planned or executed. Nutritional control served as another tool of oppression, with food rations calculated to provide just enough sustenance to maintain worker productivity while preventing the accumulation of energy reserves that might fuel resistance activities. The daily meal consisted of a protein-enriched gruel supplemented with synthetic vitamins and minerals necessary to prevent the diseases that would reduce worker efficiency. Water was distributed at specific intervals throughout the work shifts, with quantities carefully monitored to ensure that workers remained functional without gaining access to resources that could be used for unauthorized purposes. Medical care within the prison factories focused exclusively on maintaining worker productivity rather than addressing individual suffering or comfort. The medical facilities consisted of sterile chambers equipped with automated diagnostic equipment that could quickly identify conditions that might affect work performance. Treatment protocols were designed to return workers to their assigned duties as quickly as possible, with little consideration for long-term health consequences or quality of life issues. Workers who suffered injuries that prevented them from performing their assigned tasks were typically transferred to less demanding positions rather than receiving comprehensive medical treatment. The surveillance systems that monitored worker activities represented the most sophisticated aspect of the Tech Guild control apparatus. Networks of optical sensors tracked individual movements throughout the facility complexes, while audio monitoring equipment recorded conversations for analysis by automated systems programmed to identify potentially subversive content. Biometric scanners at strategic checkpoints verified worker identities and logged their presence in specific areas, creating detailed records of daily activities that could be analyzed for patterns indicating resistance activities. The psychological impact of this constant monitoring was as important as its practical applications, as workers understood that any deviation from expected behavior patterns could result in immediate punishment. Punishment protocols within the prison factories were designed to serve both as deterrents and as examples to the broader worker population. Minor infractions resulted in reduced food rations or extended work shifts that pushed individuals to the limits of physical endurance. More serious violations led to transfer to the punishment sectors, underground chambers where offenders performed dangerous tasks in conditions that frequently proved fatal. The most severe punishments involved public executions carried out in the main assembly areas, where workers were forced to witness the consequences of resistance while continuing their assigned tasks. Against this backdrop of systematic oppression, Corvus Corax began developing the strategic framework that would ultimately lead to the complete overthrow of the Tech Guild regime. His approach to revolutionary warfare demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both the technical vulnerabilities of the surveillance systems and the psychological dynamics that maintained worker compliance. Rather than attempting to organize large-scale uprisings that would inevitably be detected and crushed by the security apparatus, the Primarch focused on building a network of small, independent cells that could operate without direct coordination while contributing to a broader campaign of systematic disruption. The initial phase of his strategic plan involved the careful recruitment of individuals who possessed both the motivation to resist and the technical skills necessary to carry out sabotage operations. Corvus Corax identified workers who had demonstrated exceptional competence in their assigned tasks, as these individuals possessed the knowledge necessary to understand the vulnerabilities of the systems they operated daily. He also sought out those who had suffered personal losses due to Tech Guild oppression, as their emotional investment in the cause of liberation made them more reliable conspirators despite the risks involved. Communication between resistance cells relied on a sophisticated system of coded messages that exploited the routine interactions necessary for factory operations. Technical specifications for maintenance procedures served as vehicles for tactical information, while work schedules and production reports concealed intelligence about security patrol patterns and surveillance system capabilities. The Primarch's enhanced cognitive abilities allowed him to develop encryption methods that appeared to be routine administrative communications, while actually coordinating complex multi-cell operations across different sectors of the facility networks. The sabotage operations themselves demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that reflected both Corvus Corax's enhanced intellect and his deep understanding of the industrial systems that sustained Tech Guild power. Rather than causing obvious damage that would immediately alert security personnel, the resistance focused on subtle modifications that would cause equipment failures after extended periods of operation. Critical components were weakened in ways that would lead to catastrophic failures during peak production periods, while safety systems were compromised to increase the likelihood of industrial accidents that would disrupt operations and demoralize the workforce. Hit-and-run tactics became the signature approach of the resistance movement, with small teams of fighters striking at vulnerable targets before disappearing back into the general worker population. These operations typically involved the theft of supplies and equipment that could be used to support further resistance activities, rather than direct confrontations with security forces that would inevitably result in heavy casualties among the poorly armed revolutionaries. The Primarch's enhanced physical capabilities allowed him to personally lead the most dangerous missions, penetrating security cordons that would have been impenetrable to normal humans and extracting valuable intelligence about Tech Guild operations and defensive preparations. The psychological warfare component of the resistance campaign proved equally important to its ultimate success. Corvus Corax understood that the Tech Guilds maintained their control through the perception of invincibility and the belief among workers that resistance was futile. Each successful sabotage operation and each security breach demonstrated that the surveillance systems were not omniscient and that the technical superiority of the overlords could be overcome through intelligence and determination. Graffiti appeared overnight in areas that were supposedly under constant surveillance, while equipment failures occurred in patterns that clearly indicated deliberate sabotage rather than random mechanical problems. The resistance movement's approach to intelligence gathering exploited the tech guild's dependence on worker cooperation for the maintenance of their sophisticated control systems. Maintenance personnel who service surveillance equipment were recruited to provide information about system capabilities and blind spots, while communications technicians offered access to internal guild communications that revealed security protocols and operational plans. The overlord's assumption that their technological superiority made them immune to infiltration by the supposedly ignorant worker populations created vulnerabilities that the resistance exploited systematically. As the scope and effectiveness of resistance operations expanded, Corvus Corax began planning for the transition from guerrilla warfare to open rebellion. This phase required the development of capabilities that went beyond sabotage and intelligence gathering to include the ability to seize and hold territory against organized counterattacks by guild security forces. The Primarch's tactical planning during this period demonstrated his understanding that successful revolution required not only the destruction of the existing power structure, but also the establishment of alternative systems capable of maintaining order and providing essential services to the liberated population. The acquisition of weapons and military equipment presented a significant challenge for the resistance movement, as the tech guilds maintained strict control over all materials that could be used for combat purposes. However, the industrial nature of the prison factories provided opportunities for the improvised manufacture of weapons and explosives using materials that were readily available within the production facilities. Chemical compounds used in manufacturing processes could be combined to create explosive devices, while metalworking equipment could be used to fabricate improvised firearms and edged weapons that, while crude, proved effective in close-quarters combat situations. Training programs for resistance fighters were conducted in the deepest sections of the tunnel networks, where surveillance coverage was minimal and the risk of detection was reduced. These sessions focused on the specific tactical requirements of urban warfare within the confined spaces of the industrial complexes, emphasizing stealth, speed, and the ability to operate effectively in conditions of limited visibility and restricted movement. Corvus Corax's enhanced physical capabilities allowed him to demonstrate techniques that normal humans could adapt to their own limitations, while his tactical insights provided the strategic framework necessary for coordinating complex multi-unit operations. The final phase of the liberation campaign required a fundamental shift in strategy from guerrilla operations to conventional warfare capable of seizing control of the orbital stations that served as the ultimate centers of tech guild power. These facilities represented the most heavily defended positions within the Kievar system, equipped with advanced defensive systems and garrisoned by the elite security forces that had never been seriously challenged by the worker populations. The assault on these positions would require not only superior tactics and determination, but also the ability to operate in the vacuum of space and to overcome defensive technologies that far exceeded anything the Resistance had previously encountered. The space-based component of the liberation campaign demonstrated Corvus Corax's ability to adapt his tactical approach to completely different operational environments. The confined spaces and limited mobility that had characterized warfare within the prison factories gave way to the three-dimensional combat environment of orbital facilities, where movement in zero gravity and the constant threat of hull breaches created entirely new tactical challenges. The Primarch's enhanced physiology allowed him to adapt quickly to these conditions, while his strategic insights enabled him to develop assault plans that exploited the specific vulnerabilities of orbital defensive systems. The coordination of simultaneous attacks on multiple orbital facilities required a level of operational sophistication that demonstrated the maturation of the resistance movement from a collection of independent cells into a unified military force capable of complex strategic operations. Communication between assault teams relied on captured guild equipment that had been modified to prevent detection by defensive systems, while timing was coordinated to ensure that all attacks commenced simultaneously to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces against individual targets. The success of the orbital assaults marked the complete liberation of Deliverance, but the aftermath of victory brought new challenges that would test Corvus Corax's abilities as a leader in ways that guerrilla warfare had not. The destruction of the Tech Guild control apparatus left vast industrial complexes without operational oversight, while the worker populations who had lived under oppression for generations suddenly found themselves responsible for maintaining the complex systems that sustained life on the moon. The Primarch's enhanced cognitive abilities proved crucial during this transition period, as he worked to establish administrative structures that could coordinate the distribution of resources and maintain essential services while avoiding the creation of new forms of authoritarian control. The establishment of provisional councils drawn from the various worker populations demonstrated Corvus Corax's understanding that sustainable governance required the active participation of those who had been liberated rather than the imposition of new hierarchies from above. These councils were organized around functional specializations rather than traditional political structures, with representatives from each major industrial sector working together to address the practical challenges of reconstruction. The Primarch served as a coordinator and advisor to these bodies rather than as a supreme ruler, recognizing that the principles of liberation that had driven the resistance movement must be reflected in the structures of the new society. The industrial capacity of Deliverance, once freed from the inefficiencies imposed by the oppressive caste system, proved capable of remarkable productivity improvements. Workers who had previously been motivated only by fear of punishment now applied their skills and knowledge toward the improvement of production processes and the development of new technologies. The Primarch's technical insights, enhanced by his superhuman intellect, contributed to innovations in manufacturing techniques that increased output while reducing the dangerous working conditions that had characterized the Tech Guild period. These improvements not only enhanced the quality of life for the moon's population, but also created surplus production capacity that would prove valuable in the challenges to come. The transformation of Deliverance's military capabilities reflected the lessons learned during the Liberation campaign. The improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics that had proven effective against the Tech Guilds were systematized and refined into doctrines that could be taught to larger numbers of fighters. Training facilities were established in the former punishment sectors of the prison factories, where the harsh conditions that had once been used for oppression were repurposed to prepare defenders for the rigors of combat. The Primarch personally oversaw the development of specialized units that combined the stealth tactics of the resistance movement with conventional military organization and equipment. The arrival of the Emperor of Mankind on Deliverance occurred during this period of reconstruction and reorganization, when the moon's population was still adapting to their newfound freedom while working to establish stable institutions. The Master of Mankind's approach to the Kievar system was detected by the early warning systems that Corvus Corax had established using captured Tech Guild equipment, but the massive scale and obvious technological superiority of the approaching fleet made it clear that this was not another attempt at reconquest by the former overlords. The energy signatures and ship configurations matched no known human technology, while the sheer size of the fleet suggested a power that dwarfed anything the recently liberated moon could hope to resist. The Emperor's personal shuttle descended through Deliverance's polluted atmosphere to land in the main assembly area of the largest industrial complex, where Corvus Corax waited with representatives of the provisional councils. The Master of Mankind's physical presence radiated an authority that transcended mere political or military power, while his psychic emanations created an immediate sense of recognition in the Primarch that went beyond conscious understanding. The moment of their meeting represented the culmination of genetic imperatives that had been encoded into Corvus Corax's very essence, as the reunion between creator and creation activated dormant knowledge that had waited within his enhanced physiology since birth. The Emperor's recognition of Corvus Corax as his lost son was immediate and unambiguous, despite the Primarch's appearance having been shaped by years of hard labor and guerrilla warfare rather than the noble upbringing that might have been expected for one of his stature. The Master of Mankind's enhanced senses detected the genetic markers that identified Corvus Corax as the 19th Primarch, while his psychic abilities revealed the tactical brilliance and leadership qualities that had enabled the liberation of Deliverance. The formal acknowledgement of their relationship carried implications that extended far beyond personal recognition, as it marked the beginning of Corvus Corax's integration into the broader structure of the Great Crusade. The revelation of his true nature and destiny required significant adjustment on the part of Corvus Corax, who had understood himself to be an enhanced human with unusual capabilities rather than a genetically engineered being created for a specific purpose within a galactic conquest. The Emperor's explanation of the Primarch project and the Great Crusade provided context for abilities and instincts that had seemed inexplicable during his youth on Deliverance. The tactical insights that had enabled him to develop revolutionary strategies, the physical capabilities that had allowed him to survive in conditions that would have killed normal humans, and the leadership qualities that had inspired others to follow him into desperate battles all took on new meaning as expressions of his designed purpose. The integration of Corvus Corax with the existing 19th Legion presented challenges that reflected both the unique circumstances of his upbringing and the specific tactical doctrines that the Legion had developed during their service without their Primarch. The 19th Legion had established a reputation for effectiveness in standard Astartes operations, utilizing the enhanced physical capabilities and advanced equipment that characterized all Space Marine forces. Their tactical approach emphasized direct assault and overwhelming firepower, supported by the superior armor and weapons that made Space Marines effective against conventional opponents. However, this doctrine bore little resemblance to the stealth-based guerrilla warfare that had defined Corvus Corax's military experience. The Space Marines of the 19th Legion initially struggled to understand their Primarch's emphasis on covert operations and indirect tactics, having been trained to view such approaches as beneath the dignity of the Emperor's finest warriors. Their conditioning emphasized honor in battle and the importance of facing enemies directly, while the Primarch's methods seemed to prioritize avoiding detection and striking from concealment. The cultural gap between the Legion's traditions and their Primarch's background created tensions that required careful management to prevent the development of serious conflicts within the command structure. Corvus Corax addressed these challenges through a combination of practical demonstration and gradual doctrinal evolution that allowed the Legion to adapt to new tactical approaches without abandoning the core principles that had made them effective. He began by incorporating individual Space Marines into operations that utilized their enhanced capabilities in ways that complemented rather than replaced their existing training. Reconnaissance missions that exploited the superior senses and physical capabilities of the Astartes provided opportunities for Legion members to experience the advantages of stealth tactics while maintaining their identity as elite warriors rather than mere infiltrators. The transformation of the 19th Legion's operational doctrine proceeded through a series of training exercises and limited combat operations that gradually introduced more sophisticated stealth techniques and covert tactics. The Primarch's approach emphasized the ways in which these methods enhanced rather than diminished the effectiveness of Space Marine capabilities, demonstrating how superior reconnaissance could create opportunities for devastating strikes against enemy weak points. The psychological impact of appearing without warning in the midst of enemy positions proved particularly effective when combined with the intimidating presence and overwhelming firepower that characterized Astartes' combat operations. The renaming of the 19th Legion as the Raven Guard reflected both their new tactical focus and their connection to their Primarch's experiences on Deliverance. The symbolism of the Raven, a creature associated with intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to thrive in harsh environments, captured the essential characteristics that would define the Legion's approach to warfare. The adoption of new heraldry and ceremonial practices helped to reinforce the cultural transformation that accompanied the tactical changes, while providing visible symbols of the Legion's evolution from standard Astartes operations to specialized reconnaissance and stealth warfare. The development of specialized equipment and modifications to standard Astartes gear supported the Raven Guard's transition to their new operational role. Power armor was modified to reduce noise signatures and improve stealth capabilities, while weapons were adapted to provide effective performance in covert operations, where the standard approach of overwhelming firepower might compromise mission objectives. The Legion's technical specialists worked closely with Corvus Corax to develop innovations that combined the advanced technology of the Great Crusade with the practical lessons learned during the liberation of Deliverance. The early campaigns of the Reunited Legion during the Great Crusade provided opportunities to test and refine the new tactical doctrines under actual combat conditions. These operations were carefully selected to showcase the advantages of the Raven Guard's specialized capabilities while building confidence within the Legion and establishing their reputation among other Imperial forces. Reconnaissance missions that provided crucial intelligence for larger Imperial operations demonstrated the value of the Legion's stealth capabilities, while precision strikes against high-value targets showed how their methods could achieve strategic objectives with minimal casualties and resource expenditure. The Raven Guard's first major independent operation involved the pacification of a rebellious hive world where conventional assault tactics had proven ineffective due to the complex urban environment and the defenders' knowledge of local terrain. The Legion's approach combined detailed reconnaissance with precision strikes against command and control facilities, systematically dismantling the rebel leadership structure while avoiding the massive civilian casualties that would have resulted from a direct assault. The success of this operation established the Raven Guard's reputation as specialists in complex urban warfare and unconventional operations. Subsequent campaigns expanded the scope of the Legion's operations to include deep reconnaissance missions that penetrated far ahead of the main Imperial forces, gathering intelligence about enemy dispositions and capabilities that proved crucial for strategic planning. These operations required the development of new logistical systems that could support small units operating independently for extended periods, while maintaining communication links that allowed real-time intelligence sharing with Imperial command structures. The Raven Guard's ability to operate effectively in isolation made them valuable assets for campaigns where conventional forces would have been unable to gather necessary intelligence or establish forward positions. The psychological impact of the Raven Guard's operations extended beyond their immediate tactical effects, as their reputation for appearing without warning and striking with devastating precision created fear and uncertainty among potential enemies of the Imperium. Stories of space marines who could infiltrate supposedly impregnable positions and eliminate key targets without detection spread throughout the galaxy, contributing to the Imperium's psychological warfare capabilities. This reputation proved particularly valuable in negotiations with potential allies, as planetary governors and military leaders understood that cooperation with the Imperium was preferable to facing the alternative of covert operations by the Emperor's shadows. The integration of Corvus Corax's leadership style with the broader command structure of the Great Crusade required adjustments on both sides, as his approach to warfare and governance differed significantly from that of his brother Primarch's. His emphasis on minimizing civilian casualties and establishing just governance in conquered territories sometimes conflicted with the Imperium's need for rapid expansion and resource extraction. However, his methods proved particularly effective in situations where long-term stability was more important than immediate conquest, as populations that had been liberated rather than simply conquered were more likely to remain loyal to Imperial rule. The development of the Raven Guard's intelligence networks created capabilities that extended far beyond their immediate military operations, as the Legion established contacts and information sources throughout the sectors where they operated. These networks provided early warning of potential threats to Imperial interests, while also supporting the broader intelligence requirements of the Great Crusade. The Primarch's experience with resistance movements and underground organizations proved invaluable in establishing these systems, as he understood both the motivations that drove individuals to provide intelligence and the security measures necessary to protect valuable sources from enemy counteraction. The transformation of the 19th Legion into the Raven Guard represented a fundamental shift in Space Marine warfare doctrine that challenged conventional assumptions about how the Emperor's finest warriors should conduct themselves in battle. While other legions relied on the overwhelming application of firepower and the psychological impact of direct assault, Corvus Corax began developing tactical approaches that emphasized precision, stealth, and the systematic exploitation of enemy weaknesses. This evolution required not only changes in equipment and training, but also a complete restructuring of the Legion's organizational hierarchy to support operations that demanded unprecedented levels of individual initiative and small unit autonomy. The Raven Guard's specialization in covert operations emerged from the practical necessities of their Primarch's experiences on Deliverance, where survival had depended on the ability to strike without warning and disappear before superior forces could respond. These lessons translated into Space Marine warfare through the development of infiltration techniques that exploited the enhanced physical capabilities of the Astartes while avoiding the detection systems that protected high-value targets. Unlike the frontal assaults that characterized most Legion operations, Raven Guard strikes began long before the enemy realized they were under attack, with reconnaissance teams establishing detailed intelligence about defensive positions and identifying the critical vulnerabilities that would determine the success or failure of the mission. The Legion's approach to rapid deployment reflected their understanding that speed and surprise were more valuable than overwhelming force when properly applied. Raven Guard forces developed the capability to insert small teams deep behind enemy lines, using a variety of infiltration methods that ranged from traditional stealth approaches to more exotic techniques involving teleportation technology and orbital insertion systems. These deployment methods required extensive modification of standard Space Marine equipment to reduce detection signatures while maintaining the combat effectiveness that made the Astartes formidable opponents in direct confrontation. Jump pack technology became central to Raven Guard operations, providing the mobility necessary for rapid insertion and extraction while offering tactical advantages in three-dimensional combat environments. The Legion's technical specialists worked to develop jump pack variants that emphasize stealth characteristics over raw performance, incorporating noise suppression systems and exhaust dampening that allowed Space Marines to move through hostile airspace without alerting defensive sensors. These modifications required careful balancing of thrust capabilities against detection avoidance, resulting in equipment that demanded higher levels of pilot skill but offered unprecedented tactical flexibility. The surgical strike doctrine that defined Raven Guard operations emphasized the identification and elimination of key targets, whose destruction would cause cascading failures throughout enemy command structures. Rather than attempting to destroy entire enemy formations through attrition, Raven Guard forces focused on command and control facilities, communication nodes, and supply depots whose loss would render larger enemy forces ineffective regardless of their numerical strength. This approach required detailed intelligence gathering and precise coordination between multiple small units, capabilities that the Legion developed through extensive training in reconnaissance and target assessment. The organizational structure of the Raven Guard reflected their operational requirements through the establishment of smaller, more flexible formations that could operate independently while contributing to larger strategic objectives. Traditional Space Marine companies were subdivided into specialized teams that combined reconnaissance, assault, and support capabilities within single operational units. These teams typically consisted of 10 to 15 Space Marines selected for complementary skills and equipped with specialized gear appropriate to their assigned roles within the unit's tactical framework. The emphasis on elite formations over massed infantry assaults required a fundamental change in how the Legion approached recruitment and training. While other legions could rely on the standard Astartes enhancement process to produce effective warriors, the Raven Guard needed individuals who possessed not only physical capabilities, but also the intelligence and psychological characteristics necessary for independent operations in hostile environments. The selection process became more rigorous, focusing on candidates who demonstrated exceptional problem-solving abilities and the mental resilience necessary to operate alone or in small groups for extended periods. Recruitment practices for the Raven Guard drew heavily from Deliverance's population, whose experiences under Tech Guild oppression had produced individuals with natural aptitudes for stealth, survival, and resistance operations. The harsh conditions of the Moon's industrial complexes had created a population that understood the importance of careful observation, patient planning, and the ability to exploit small advantages against superior opponents. These characteristics translated well to the requirements of covert warfare, while the cultural emphasis on self-reliance and independence aligned with the Legion's operational doctrine. The importance of self-reliance within Raven Guard culture extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass the philosophical framework that guided the Legion's approach to warfare and their relationship with the broader Imperium. Space Marines who operated in small units behind enemy lines could not rely on immediate support from their brothers or guidance from superior officers when critical decisions needed to be made. The ability to assess situations independently and take appropriate action without detailed orders became a fundamental requirement for all Raven Guard personnel, regardless of their position within the Legion's hierarchy. Independence of thought and action, while essential for the Legion's operational effectiveness, created challenges for integration with Imperial command structures that emphasized strict adherence to orders and centralized decision-making. Raven Guard officers needed to balance their tactical autonomy with the strategic objectives established by higher authorities, requiring sophisticated understanding of both immediate battlefield conditions and broader campaign goals. This balance was achieved through extensive briefings that provided context for individual missions, while allowing field commanders the flexibility necessary to adapt to changing circumstances. The development of specialized equipment for the Raven Guard involved modifications to standard Space Marine gear that enhanced stealth capabilities while maintaining combat effectiveness. Power armor received acoustic dampening systems that reduced the noise signatures produced by servo motors and joint mechanisms, while visual camouflage systems provided limited optical concealment in appropriate environments. These modifications required careful engineering to avoid compromising the protective capabilities that made power armor essential for Space Marine survival in hostile environments. Stealth gear developed specifically for Raven Guard operations included sensor jammers that could disrupt enemy detection systems within limited ranges, allowing small teams to approach defended positions without triggering automated alarm systems. Personal cloaking devices provided temporary optical concealment for individual Space Marines, though the power requirements and limited duration of these systems restricted their use to critical moments during infiltration or extraction operations. Communication equipment was modified to provide secure channels that could penetrate enemy jamming while avoiding detection by hostile intelligence services. The modification of standard power armor for Raven Guard operations involved more than simple additions of stealth equipment, requiring fundamental changes to the armor's design philosophy. Weight distribution was adjusted to improve mobility and reduce fatigue during extended infiltration missions, while joint articulation was enhanced to provide greater flexibility for movement in confined spaces. The iconic black coloration of Raven Guard armor served both practical and psychological purposes, providing camouflage in low-light conditions, while projecting an intimidating image that reinforced the Legion's reputation for appearing without warning. Weapon systems used by the Raven Guard emphasized accuracy and reliability over raw firepower, reflecting the Legion's need for precise elimination of specific targets rather than area suppression of enemy formations. Bolt weapons received modifications that reduced muzzle flash and report while maintaining the stopping power necessary for effective engagement of heavily armored opponents. Specialized ammunition types included subsonic rounds for covert operations and armor-piercing variants designed to defeat specific types of protective equipment commonly encountered during infiltration missions. Close combat weapons favored by the Raven Guard reflected their emphasis on swift, silent elimination of sentries and isolated opponents. Combat knives and other edged weapons received enhanced materials and design modifications that improved their effectiveness while reducing the noise produced during use. Power weapons were modified to minimize the energy discharges that could reveal their activation to enemy sensors, while maintaining the enhanced cutting ability that made them effective against armored opponents. The Legion's approach to vehicle warfare emphasized mobility and stealth over heavy armor and firepower, leading to the development of specialized variants of standard Imperial designs. Land speeders received extensive modifications that reduced their sensor signatures while improving their performance in reconnaissance roles, including enhanced communication equipment and sensor packages that allowed them to serve as mobile command posts for dispersed ground forces. Rhino transports were modified with noise suppression systems and improved camouflage that allowed them to insert teams closer to their objectives without detection. Aircraft used by the Raven Guard incorporated advanced stealth technologies that rendered them nearly invisible to most detection systems, though these modifications came at the cost of reduced payload capacity and operational range. Thunderhawks received modifications that emphasized their transport capabilities over their ground attack potential, while specialized variants were developed specifically for covert insertion and extraction missions. These aircraft required highly skilled pilots who could navigate complex terrain at low altitude while avoiding enemy detection systems. The training regimen for Raven Guard Space Marines incorporated elements drawn from Corvus Corax's experiences during the liberation of Deliverance, emphasizing skills that were rarely taught to other Legion personnel. Infiltration techniques included instruction in lock-picking, electronic surveillance, and the interpretation of enemy communication intercepts. Combat training focused on silent elimination methods and the use of improvised weapons when standard equipment was unavailable or inappropriate for specific mission requirements. Psychological conditioning for Raven Guard personnel addressed the unique stresses associated with covert operations, including extended periods of isolation and the constant threat of discovery while operating behind enemy lines. Space Marines needed to develop the mental discipline necessary to remain concealed for hours or days while observing enemy positions, as well as the emotional control required to avoid detection when enemy personnel passed within meters of their concealed positions. This conditioning built upon the standard Astartes psychological enhancement while adding specialized elements appropriate to the Legion's operational requirements. The command structure within Raven Guard formations reflected their emphasis on small unit operations and individual initiative, with authority distributed more broadly among junior officers than was typical in other legions. Squad leaders received training in tactical planning and intelligence analysis that allowed them to operate effectively without constant supervision from higher-ranking officers. This approach required careful selection of personnel for leadership positions, as the decentralized command structure could only function effectively when subordinate officers possessed both the competence and the judgment necessary to make critical decisions independently. Communication protocols within the Raven Guard emphasized security and redundancy to ensure that dispersed units could maintain coordination while avoiding detection by enemy intelligence services. Multiple communication channels were established for each operation, with backup systems available in case primary methods were compromised or jammed. code systems were regularly updated to prevent enemy cryptanalysis, while communication discipline was strictly enforced to minimize the risk of inadvertent intelligence disclosure. The integration of intelligence gathering with combat operations became a defining characteristic of Raven Guard missions, as the Legion's reconnaissance capabilities often provided information that was as valuable as the direct military effects of their strikes. Space Marines trained in intelligence collection techniques could assess enemy capabilities and intentions while conducting their primary missions, providing Imperial commanders with detailed information about hostile forces and defensive preparations. This dual-purpose approach maximized the value of each covert operation while reducing the risk associated with dedicated intelligence missions. The Kava's Belt presented the newly unified Raven Guard with their first major test as a cohesive legion under Corvus Corax's direct command. This star system, located in the outer reaches of Segmentum Solar, had resisted Imperial compliance for nearly 2 decades through a combination of technological superiority and defensive strategies that had frustrated 3 previous expeditionary fleets. The system's primary inhabited worlds were protected by an extensive network of orbital defense platforms and automated weapon systems that could detect and engage Imperial vessels at extreme range, while the planets themselves were honeycombed with underground facilities that had proven impervious to conventional bombardment. The Kava system's defenders had learned to exploit the limitations of standard Imperial assault doctrine, which relied heavily on orbital bombardment followed by mass deployment of ground forces. Their defensive installations were specifically designed to counter these approaches, with hardened bunkers that could withstand sustained fire from battleship weapons and sensor networks that provided early warning of any approaching Imperial forces. Previous compliance attempts had resulted in costly stalemates, with Imperial forces unable to establish secure beachheads, while the defenders remained safely entrenched in their fortified positions. Corvus Corax's approach to the Kava's compliance demonstrated the tactical principles that would define Raven Guard operations throughout the Great Crusade. Rather than attempting to overwhelm the system's defenses through superior firepower, the Primarch ordered detailed reconnaissance missions that would map the defensive network and identify critical vulnerabilities. Small teams of Raven Guard infiltrators were inserted into the outer system using modified transport vessels that could avoid detection by the automated sensor arrays, while specialized reconnaissance units conducted extended observation of the orbital defense platforms to understand their operational patterns and limitations. The intelligence gathered during these preliminary operations revealed that the Kava's defenders had concentrated their efforts on protecting against large-scale assaults, while neglecting the security measures necessary to prevent infiltration by small, highly trained forces. The orbital platforms were designed to engage capital ships and massed fighter formations, but their sensor systems were not configured to detect individual space marines using advanced stealth equipment. Similarly, the underground facilities on the planets below had been constructed to withstand bombardment from above, but their internal security systems were vulnerable to infiltration by forces that could gain access to maintenance tunnels and service corridors. The Raven Guard's assault on the Kava system began with simultaneous infiltration missions targeting the command and control centers that coordinated the defensive network. Teams of Space Marines equipped with specialized stealth gear penetrated the orbital platforms during routine maintenance periods, when external airlocks were opened and security protocols were temporarily relaxed. These infiltrators moved through the platform's internal structures using ventilation systems and cargo passages, avoiding the main corridors where automated security systems maintained constant surveillance. The elimination of key personnel within the orbital defense network created cascading failures that disabled entire sections of the protective grid without alerting the remaining defenders to the true nature of the threat they faced. Command officers responsible for coordinating defensive fire were eliminated silently, while technical specialists who maintained the automated systems were replaced by Raven Guard personnel who had studied their routines and could mimic their behavior long enough to introduce critical malfunctions into the defensive network. These operations required precise timing and coordination between multiple infiltration teams, as premature discovery of any single mission could have compromised the entire assault. The systematic dismantling of the Cave's defensive network demonstrated the effectiveness of the Raven Guard's approach to warfare, as strategic objectives that had resisted conventional assault for decades were achieved within hours through the precise application of covert tactics. The orbital platforms that had protected the system were turned against each other as compromised control systems directed their weapons toward friendly targets, while the automated defense systems that had frustrated previous Imperial assaults were disabled from within by infiltrators who understood their operational requirements and vulnerabilities. The ground assault phase of the Cave's compliance showcased the Raven Guard's ability to combine stealth tactics with conventional Space Marine capabilities when circumstances required direct confrontation. With the orbital defenses neutralized, Corvus Corax led his forces in a series of precision strikes against the underground command facilities that controlled the planetary defense networks. These operations utilized the detailed intelligence gathered during the preliminary reconnaissance phase, allowing Raven Guard forces to bypass heavily defended surface installations and strike directly at the critical nodes that maintained enemy resistance. The underground facilities beneath Cave's Prime presented a complex three-dimensional battlefield that favored the Raven Guard's specialized training and equipment. The narrow corridors and confined spaces that had been designed to channel attackers into killing zones became advantages for Space Marines who could navigate through maintenance shafts and utility tunnels to approach their objectives from unexpected directions. Jump pack-equipped assault teams moved through vertical shafts and elevator wells to strike at multiple levels simultaneously, while infiltration specialists disabled security systems and opened alternate routes for follow-up forces. The psychological impact of the Raven Guard's operations on the Cave's defenders proved as significant as their direct military effects. The systematic failure of defensive systems that had been considered impregnable created confusion and demoralization among the enemy forces, while the apparent ability of Imperial forces to strike anywhere within supposedly secure facilities undermined confidence in their leadership and defensive preparations. Reports of Space Marines appearing without warning in the deepest levels of underground bunkers spread panic among garrison forces who had never faced opponents capable of penetrating their elaborate security measures. The successful compliance of the Cave's system established the Raven Guard's reputation within the Imperial military hierarchy as specialists in operations that required unconventional approaches to seemingly impossible tactical problems. The speed and efficiency of their victory, achieved with minimal casualties among Imperial forces, demonstrated the value of their specialized capabilities and provided a template for future operations against similarly well-defended targets. Word of their success spread throughout the Great Crusade's command structure, leading to requests for Raven Guard participation in campaigns where conventional assault tactics had proven ineffective. The campaign against the Corvus Retribution presented an entirely different set of challenges that tested Corvus Corax's abilities as a void warfare strategist rather than a ground combat specialist. This massive space hulk, constructed from the amalgamated remains of dozens of warships and civilian vessels, had been converted into a mobile fortress by a confederation of human separatists who used it as a base for raids against Imperial shipping lanes. The hulk's irregular construction and composite armor made it nearly impervious to conventional naval weapons, while its massive size allowed it to carry fighter squadrons and assault craft that could overwhelm smaller Imperial vessels. Previous attempts to neutralize the Corvus Retribution had failed due to the difficulties inherent in engaging such an unconventional target with standard Imperial Navy tactics. The Space Hulk's erratic movement patterns and unpredictable structural configuration made it impossible to predict where critical systems might be located, while its composite construction meant that damage to one section rarely affected the operational capability of other areas. Conventional fleet engagements had proven ineffective, as the Hulk could absorb tremendous amounts of damage while continuing to function as a combat platform. Corvus Corax's analysis of the tactical situation revealed that the Corrini Retribution's greatest strength, its massive, irregular construction, could also be exploited as a vulnerability if Imperial forces could gain access to its internal structure. The Space Hulk's composite nature meant that its various sections were connected by improvised passages and jury-rigged systems that had not been designed for military operations. These connections represented potential weak points that could be exploited by boarding parties equipped with specialized equipment and trained in close-quarters combat within spacecraft environments. The Raven Guard's approach to the Corrini Retribution combined elements of their ground-based infiltration tactics with void warfare techniques adapted specifically for operations within the confines of spacecraft. Boarding parties were equipped with modified power armor that provided enhanced mobility in zero-gravity environments while maintaining the stealth characteristics necessary for covert operations. Specialized cutting tools and demolition charges were designed to create access points through the Hulk's composite armor without causing catastrophic decompression that would alert the defenders to the boarding attempt. The insertion of Raven Guard forces into the Corrini Retribution required precise coordination between multiple specialized units operating in the three-dimensional environment of void combat. Assault boats equipped with stealth systems approached the Space Hulk from multiple vectors, using its own massive bulk to mask their approach from defensive sensors. Boarding teams were deployed at carefully selected points where the Hulk's irregular construction created blind spots in its defensive coverage, allowing the Space Marines to gain access to internal passages without triggering the automated defense systems that protected more obvious entry points. The internal structure of the Corrini Retribution presented a maze of interconnected passages, cargo holds, and improvised living spaces that had been carved from the hulls of the original vessels that comprised the Space Hulk. Navigation through this environment required careful mapping and constant communication between boarding teams to prevent units from becoming lost in the labyrinthine interior. The Raven Guard's enhanced senses and specialized equipment proved crucial for maintaining orientation within the Hulk's confusing layout, while their training in close-quarters combat allowed them to engage defenders in the cramped passages and confined spaces that characterized much of the internal fighting. The systematic elimination of the Corrini Retribution's command structure followed the same principles that had proven successful during the Cave's compliance, with Raven Guard forces targeting the key personnel and critical systems that maintained the Space Hulk's operational effectiveness. Command centers were identified through careful observation of communication patterns and power distribution systems, while technical specialists who maintained the Hulk's improvised systems were eliminated or captured to prevent them from implementing countermeasures against the boarding operation. The void warfare aspects of the Corrini Retribution campaign demonstrated Corvus Corax's ability to adapt his tactical principles to completely different operational environments while maintaining the core advantages that made the Raven Guard effective. The precision and coordination required for successful boarding operations in void combat demanded different skills than ground-based infiltration missions, but the fundamental approach of identifying critical vulnerabilities and exploiting them through carefully planned strikes remained consistent. The Primarch's strategic insights allowed him to recognize how the unique characteristics of void combat could be turned to advantage by forces trained in unconventional warfare techniques. The successful neutralization of the Corrini Retribution established Corvus Corax's reputation as a void warfare strategist capable of solving tactical problems that had frustrated conventional Imperial Navy commanders. The operation's success led to increased cooperation between the Raven Guard and Imperial Navy forces, as fleet commanders recognized the value of having specialized boarding troops available for operations against unconventional targets. The techniques developed during the campaign were subsequently incorporated into Imperial Navy doctrine for dealing with space hulks and other irregular spacecraft that could not be effectively engaged through conventional fleet actions. Joint operations with other Space Marine legions provided opportunities for the Raven Guard to demonstrate their specialized capabilities while learning from the tactical approaches developed by their brother legions. These collaborative campaigns often revealed significant differences in operational philosophy and combat doctrine, as the Raven Guard's emphasis on stealth and precision sometimes conflicted with the more direct approaches favored by other Primarchs. However, these differences also created opportunities for synergistic effects when the various legion specializations were properly coordinated to support common objectives. The campaign on Lycaeus fought alongside elements of the Imperial Fists demonstrated both the potential benefits and the inherent challenges of inter-legion cooperation. The Imperial Fist's expertise in siege warfare and defensive operations complemented the Raven Guard's infiltration capabilities, allowing Imperial forces to establish secure positions while Raven Guard reconnaissance teams gathered intelligence about enemy dispositions and defensive preparations. However, the Imperial Fist's preference for methodical, systematic approaches to combat operations sometimes conflicted with the Raven Guard's emphasis on rapid, opportunistic strikes that exploited temporary advantages. The tactical coordination required for successful joint operations demanded careful planning and clear communication between Legion commanders who had been trained in fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Rogel Dorn's systematic methodology provided a stable foundation for complex operations, while Corvus Corax's adaptive tactics allowed Imperial forces to respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The combination of these approaches proved particularly effective against opponents who had prepared defenses designed to counter conventional Imperial assault doctrine, as the Raven Guard's reconnaissance capabilities identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Imperial Fist siege specialists. Friction between the legions occasionally arose from differences in their approaches to civilian populations and the treatment of conquered territories. The Raven Guard's emphasis on minimizing collateral damage and establishing just governance reflected Corvus Corax's experiences on Deliverance, where he had learned to distinguish between oppressors and their victims. Other legions sometimes viewed these concerns as impediments to military efficiency, preferring to focus on achieving tactical objectives without regard for secondary considerations that might complicate operations or slow the pace of conquest. The development of Corvus Corax's reputation among his brother Primarchs reflected both respect for his tactical abilities and occasional disagreement with his operational methods. Primarchs who favored direct confrontation and overwhelming force sometimes questioned the necessity of the elaborate preparations and careful planning that characterized Raven Guard operations. However, the consistent success of these methods in achieving strategic objectives with minimal casualties gradually earned recognition from even the most skeptical of his brothers, particularly when conventional approaches had proven ineffective or excessively costly. The Raven Guard's specialized capabilities made them valuable allies for Primarchs whose own tactical preferences complemented rather than duplicated their methods. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars appreciated the intelligence-gathering capabilities that supported his rapid strike operations, while Vulcan of the Salamanders found common ground in the Raven Guard's concern for civilian casualties and post-conquest governance. These relationships developed into lasting partnerships that enhanced the effectiveness of joint operations and contributed to the overall success of the Great Crusade's expansion into previously resistant sectors. The transformation of Deliverance from an industrial hellscape into what Corvus Corax envisioned as a model world represented one of the most ambitious social engineering projects undertaken by any Primarch during the Great Crusade. Where once the moon's surface had been scarred by the brutal machinery of oppression, vast construction projects began reshaping the landscape, according to principles that balanced industrial necessity with human dignity. The towering spires that had once housed tech guild overlords were systematically dismantled, their materials repurposed for housing complexes designed to provide every worker with private living space, natural lighting, and access to recreational facilities that had been unimaginable under the previous regime. The underground tunnel networks that had served as both workplace and prison were extensively modified to create environments that supported rather than degraded human health and morale. Advanced atmospheric processing systems replaced the toxic air that had characterized the mining operations, while artificial lighting systems mimicked natural daylight cycles to combat the psychological effects of permanent subterranean existence. The cramped dormitories where workers had been packed like cargo were replaced by individual quarters that included space for personal possessions, private hygiene facilities, and communication systems that allowed residents to maintain contact with family members working in other sectors of the facility networks. Corvus Corax personally oversaw the development of governance structures that would prevent the concentration of power that had enabled the tech guild oppression, while maintaining the coordination necessary for complex industrial operations. The provisional councils that had emerged during the liberation were formalized into a representative system where workers from each specialized sector elected delegates to regional assemblies. These assemblies possessed authority over resource allocation, work scheduling, and conflict resolution within their jurisdictions, while a planetary council composed of representatives from all regions addressed issues that affected the entire moon's population. The Primarch's approach to democratic governance reflected his understanding that sustainable freedom required active participation from those who had been liberated rather than the imposition of benevolent authoritarianism from above. Regular assemblies provided forums where workers could voice concerns about working conditions, propose improvements to production processes, and participate in decisions about resource allocation and infrastructure development. The transparency of these proceedings, broadcast throughout the facility networks via communication systems, ensured that all residents could observe the decision-making processes that affected their daily lives. Educational initiatives established throughout Deliverance addressed the systematic suppression of knowledge that had characterized tech guild rule. Technical training programs taught workers to understand and maintain the complex systems they operated, transforming them from mere operators following prescribed procedures into skilled technicians capable of innovation and improvement. Literacy programs ensured that all residents could access written information and participate fully in the democratic processes that governed their society. Historical education provided context for the liberation struggle and emphasized the principles of justice and human dignity that had motivated the resistance movement. The industrial reorganization of Deliverance demonstrated Corvus Corax's belief that efficient production could be achieved without sacrificing worker welfare or environmental sustainability. Manufacturing processes were redesigned to eliminate the most dangerous working conditions while maintaining output levels necessary for the moon's economic viability. Automation systems were implemented not to replace human workers, but to remove them from hazardous tasks while creating opportunities for more skilled and rewarding employment in system maintenance and process optimization. Quality control measures emphasized craftsmanship and pride in workmanship rather than the fear-based compliance that had characterized production under the tech guilds. The environmental restoration projects initiated across Deliverance reflected the Primarch's vision of a world where industrial activity enhanced rather than degraded the conditions necessary for human flourishing. Atmospheric processors worked to eliminate the toxic compounds that had accumulated during centuries of unregulated manufacturing, while hydroponics facilities provided fresh food that supplemented the synthetic rations that had been the sole nutrition source for most workers. Green spaces were carved from former industrial sites, creating parks and recreational areas where residents could experience natural environments that had been completely absent from their previous existence. Cultural development programs encouraged the expression of artistic and intellectual creativity that had been suppressed under the oppressive regime. Music, literature, and visual arts flourished as residents gained access to materials and time necessary for creative pursuits. Libraries were established in every major residential complex, stocked with technical manuals, historical texts, and recreational reading materials that had been forbidden to the worker populations. Performance spaces provided venues for theatrical productions, concerts, and public gatherings that strengthened community bonds and celebrated the cultural diversity of Deliverance's population. The philosophical framework that guided these transformations reflected Corvus Corax's deep conviction that precision and restraint in the application of force were morally superior to overwhelming displays of power when both approaches could achieve the same objectives. This principle, forged during his experiences as a guerrilla leader fighting against technologically superior opponents, influenced every aspect of his governance and military leadership. The Primarch consistently argued that the true measure of strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when alternative approaches might prove more effective. This philosophical stance created tension with other imperial commanders who viewed the systematic application of overwhelming force as the most efficient method for achieving compliance and maintaining order. The standard imperial approach to conquest emphasized the demonstration of superior firepower as both a practical military tactic and a psychological tool that discouraged resistance through the promise of inevitable defeat. Corvus Corax's preference for precision strikes and minimal collateral damage was sometimes interpreted as weakness or inefficiency by commanders who measured success primarily through the speed of conquest rather than the sustainability of the resulting compliance. The debates that arose within imperial command structures regarding appropriate levels of force reflected fundamental differences in how various Primarchs understood the ultimate objectives of the Great Crusade. Those who prioritized rapid expansion and resource extraction viewed civilian casualties and infrastructure damage as acceptable costs for achieving strategic goals within acceptable timeframes. Corvus Corax argued that excessive destruction created long-term problems that outweighed short-term tactical advantages, as populations that had been brutalized during conquest were more likely to harbor resentment and organize resistance movements that would require ongoing military resources to suppress. The practical implementation of these principles during Raven Guard operations required careful balancing between military effectiveness and moral constraints that other legions did not impose upon themselves. Intelligence gathering became even more critical when precision strikes needed to eliminate specific targets without causing collateral damage to nearby civilian populations or essential infrastructure. Target selection processes included detailed analysis of potential secondary effects, while mission planning incorporated contingencies for minimizing unintended consequences when operations encountered unexpected complications. The training programs developed for Raven Guard personnel emphasized the ethical dimensions of their enhanced capabilities, teaching Space Marines to consider the broader implications of their actions rather than simply focusing on immediate tactical objectives. Combat doctrine included specific protocols for distinguishing between legitimate military targets and civilian populations, while rules of engagement were designed to prevent the escalation of violence beyond levels necessary for mission accomplishment. These constraints required higher levels of discipline and judgment from individual Space Marines, as they needed to make complex moral calculations under the stress of combat conditions. The relationship between Corvus Corax and the civilian population of Deliverance demonstrated his unique position among the Primarchs as both a military commander and a civilian leader who maintained direct responsibility for the welfare of a specific population. Unlike his brothers who focused primarily on military campaigns while leaving governance to imperial administrators, the Raven Lord continued to involve himself in the day-to-day management of Deliverance's social and economic development. This dual role required him to balance the demands of the Great Crusade with his obligations to the people who had supported his rise to power and continued to look to him for leadership. Regular visits to Deliverance between military campaigns allowed Corvus Corax to maintain personal connections with the communities that had shaped his character and values. These visits were not ceremonial appearances, but working sessions where the Primarch participated in council meetings, toured industrial facilities, and engaged in detailed discussions about ongoing challenges and future development plans. His presence reinforced the democratic principles that govern Deliverance, while providing opportunities for residents to communicate directly with their leader about issues that affected their daily lives. The administrative systems established on Deliverance reflected the Primarch's understanding that effective governance required both centralized coordination and local autonomy. Regional councils possessed authority to address issues specific to their areas, while maintaining communication with planetary leadership through regular reporting and consultation processes. Resource allocation decisions balanced local needs against moon-wide priorities, while dispute resolution mechanisms provided peaceful alternatives to the violence that had characterized conflict resolution under the tech guilds. Economic development policies emphasized sustainability and worker welfare rather than maximum short-term production, reflecting Corvus Corax's belief that long-term prosperity required investment in human capital and environmental protection. Trade relationships with other imperial worlds were structured to provide fair compensation for Deliverance's manufactured goods, while avoiding the exploitative relationships that had characterized the Moon's previous economic arrangements. Surplus production was reinvested in infrastructure improvements and social programs, rather than being extracted for the benefit of external authorities. The success of Deliverance's transformation attracted attention from imperial administrators and other Primarchs who were interested in understanding how the Raven Lord had achieved such dramatic improvements in productivity and social stability. Delegations from other worlds visited to observe the governance systems and industrial practices that had replaced the oppressive tech guild regime. Some visitors expressed skepticism about the sustainability of democratic governance in an imperial context, while others sought to implement similar reforms in their own territories. The idealistic nature of Corvus Corax's vision for human society created ongoing tension with the brutal realities of the Great Crusade, where military necessity often required actions that conflicted with his philosophical principles. The systematic conquest of human worlds frequently involved the destruction of existing political systems and the imposition of imperial authority through force, regardless of whether the previous governments had been oppressive or benevolent. The Primarch struggled with the moral implications of participating in campaigns that brought freedom to some populations, while imposing subjugation on others who had committed no crimes beyond independence from imperial rule. The psychological burden of these contradictions affected Corvus Corax's approach to military leadership and his relationships with other imperial commanders. His preference for minimizing civilian casualties and preserving existing infrastructure sometimes conflicted with strategic objectives that required rapid conquest regardless of collateral damage. The Primarch's insistence on careful target selection and precision strikes occasionally slowed the pace of military operations, creating friction with commanders who prioritized speed over humanitarian concerns. The development of Raven Guard doctrine reflected these philosophical tensions through the incorporation of ethical guidelines that were absent from other Legion operational procedures. Rules of engagement included specific provisions for the protection of non-combatants and the preservation of cultural sites and essential infrastructure. Mission planning processes required assessment of alternatives to destructive approaches, while after-action reviews included evaluation of civilian impact alongside traditional measures of tactical success. The integration of humanitarian concerns with military effectiveness required innovations in tactics and equipment that allowed Raven Guard forces to achieve strategic objectives while adhering to stricter ethical constraints than other Imperial forces accepted. Non-lethal weapon systems were developed for crowd control and area denial operations, where civilian casualties needed to be minimized. Precision munitions were designed to eliminate specific targets without causing extensive collateral damage to surrounding structures. Intelligence gathering capabilities were enhanced to provide detailed information about civilian populations and infrastructure that needed protection during military operations. The philosophical ideals that had guided Corvus Corax through the liberation of Deliverance and the transformation of the Raven Guard would face their ultimate test on the volcanic world of Isstvan V, where the Emperor's grand design for humanity would shatter against the brutal reality of fraternal betrayal. The deployment orders that reached the Raven Guard fleet in the Isstvan system carried the highest priority classifications, bearing the personal seal of War Master Horus himself. Intelligence reports indicated that the Third Legion had turned traitor, with Fulgrim's Emperor's children joining the rebellion that had already consumed 4 legions. The scale of the betrayal demanded an immediate and overwhelming response to prevent the contagion of treachery from spreading further through the Imperium's military forces. The strategic situation on Isstvan V presented challenges that would test every aspect of the Raven Guard's specialized capabilities. The planet's surface was dominated by active volcanic regions that created natural defensive positions while limiting the effectiveness of orbital bombardment. Massive lava flows carved the landscape into isolated sectors connected by narrow corridors that could be easily defended by determined forces. The atmospheric conditions, thick with volcanic ash and sulfurous gases, reduced visibility and interfered with communications equipment, creating an environment where the Raven Guard's enhanced senses and stealth capabilities would provide significant advantages over conventional assault forces. Corvus Corax arrived at the Isstvan system aboard his flagship, the Shadow of the Emperor, leading a fleet that represented the full strength of the 19th Legion. Nearly 80,000 Raven Guard Space Marines, prepared for what their Primarch understood would be one of the most critical battles of the Great Crusade. The reports from the initial engagements on Isstvan III had revealed the extent of the traitor force's corruption, with entire companies of Space Marines turning their weapons against their former brothers. The systematic nature of the betrayal suggested coordination at the highest levels of the rebellious legions, requiring a response that would demonstrate the Imperium's resolve to crush treachery wherever it manifested. The assault plan developed by the War Master's command staff called for a coordinated drop assault involving 7 Space Marine legions, divided into 2 waves that would overwhelm the traitor forces through superior numbers and tactical coordination. The first wave would consist of the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamanders, 3 legions whose combined strength approached 250,000 Space Marines. These forces would establish beachheads on the planet's surface and engage the traitor positions directly, drawing their attention and resources away from the landing zones where the second wave would deploy. The second wave, comprising the Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion, would land after the initial assault had committed the traitor forces to defensive positions. This follow-up force would provide the additional strength necessary to break through the enemy lines and complete the destruction of the rebellious legions. The plan's elegance lay in its simplicity, utilizing the combined might of 7 legions to achieve what individual forces had failed to accomplish on Isstvan III. The War Master's personal oversight of the operation ensured that every detail had been considered and that the traitor forces would face annihilation rather than the prolonged siege warfare that had characterized the earlier engagement. Corvus Corax studied the tactical briefings with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his approach to warfare since his earliest days on Deliverance. The volcanic terrain of Isstvan V would favor defensive operations, allowing the traitor forces to establish fortified positions that could withstand conventional assault tactics. However, the same environmental conditions that strengthened defensive positions would also provide opportunities for the infiltration techniques that had proven so effective during previous Raven Guard operations. The reduced visibility and communication difficulties that hampered conventional forces would be less problematic for Space Marines equipped with enhanced senses and specialized equipment designed for covert operations. The deployment of the Raven Guard forces reflected Corvus Corax's understanding that the initial assault would require both conventional firepower and specialized reconnaissance capabilities. The Legion's veteran companies, equipped with jump packs and stealth gear, would spearhead the advance by identifying enemy positions and eliminating key defensive installations. Supporting elements would follow up these initial strikes with heavier weapons and equipment necessary for sustained combat operations. The coordination between these different tactical elements would be crucial for maintaining the momentum necessary to establish secure landing zones for the second wave forces. The approach to Isstvan V revealed the full extent of the traitor force's defensive preparations. Orbital sensors detected extensive fortification networks carved into the volcanic rock, with interconnected bunker systems that could support each other against assault forces approaching from multiple directions. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned on elevated volcanic ridges commanded overlapping fields of fire that would make conventional drop pod assaults extremely hazardous. The traitor forces had clearly learned from their experiences on Isstvan III, adapting their tactics to counter the standard Imperial assault doctrine that relied on overwhelming firepower and rapid deployment. The Iron Hands fleet, commanded by Ferrus Manus, took position alongside the Raven Guard vessels as the first wave prepared for deployment. The 10th Legion's approach to warfare emphasized technological superiority and systematic destruction of enemy capabilities, complementing the Raven Guard's precision tactics with the firepower necessary to suppress defensive positions. The coordination between the two legions had been refined through previous joint operations, with established communication protocols and tactical procedures that would ensure effective cooperation despite the challenging environmental conditions on the planet's surface. Vulcan salamanders completed the first wave deployment, their expertise in close-quarters combat and defensive operations providing the final element necessary for the assault plan's success. The 18th Legion's reputation for resilience and determination made them ideal for the sustained combat that would be required to maintain the beachheads once they were established. Their specialized equipment, designed for operations in extreme environmental conditions, would prove particularly valuable in the volcanic environment of Isstvan V, where standard Imperial gear might fail under the stress of constant exposure to heat and corrosive gases. The drop pod assault began with the precision timing that characterized all major Imperial military operations. Thousands of armored pods streaked through Isstvan V's atmosphere, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they penetrated the thick layers of volcanic ash and sulfurous gases that shrouded the planet's surface. The Raven Guard pods, modified with enhanced stealth systems and precision guidance equipment, targeted specific landing zones that had been identified through detailed reconnaissance, as offering the best opportunities for establishing secure positions while avoiding the heaviest concentrations of enemy defensive fire. Corvus Corax led the initial assault personally, his command pod touching down in a narrow valley between two volcanic ridges that provided natural cover from enemy observation, while offering multiple routes for advancing toward the primary traitor positions. The Primarch's enhanced senses immediately detected the chemical signatures of enemy forces positioned in the surrounding terrain, while his tactical analysis identified the defensive patterns that would need to be overcome to achieve the mission objectives. The volcanic environment created unique challenges for both sides, with unstable ground conditions and toxic atmospheric gases requiring constant attention to equipment maintenance and personnel safety. The first hours of the assault proceeded according to plan, with Raven Guard forces establishing secure perimeters around their landing zones, while reconnaissance teams pushed forward to identify enemy positions and defensive capabilities. The traitor forces responded with disciplined defensive fire and coordinated counterattacks that demonstrated their continued tactical competence despite their betrayal of the Imperium. The volcanic terrain channeled the fighting into narrow corridors, where superior numbers provided less advantage than tactical skill and individual combat prowess, conditions that favored the specialized training and equipment of the Raven Guard. The Iron Hands and Salamanders faced similar challenges in their assigned sectors, with the traitor forces demonstrating unexpected resilience and tactical sophistication. The defensive positions had been carefully prepared to exploit the natural advantages of the volcanic terrain, with interlocking fields of fire and fallback positions that allowed the defenders to maintain organized resistance even when individual strongpoints were overrun. The systematic nature of these preparations suggested extensive planning and coordination, indicating that the traitor forces had anticipated the Imperial response and prepared accordingly. As the first wave forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the arrival of the second wave, Corvus Corax received reports from his reconnaissance teams that painted a disturbing picture of the enemy's capabilities and intentions. The traitor forces were not simply defending their positions, but appeared to be implementing a complex tactical plan that went beyond mere survival. Movement patterns observed in the enemy rear areas suggested the preparation of major offensive operations, while communication intercepts indicated coordination between different traitor units that implied a unified command structure rather than the desperate resistance that might have been expected from defeated rebels. The arrival of the second wave forces should have marked the beginning of the end for the traitor resistance on Isstvan V. The Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion represented some of the most capable military units in the Imperium, with combined strength that dwarfed the forces that the first wave had already engaged. The deployment of these additional legions would provide the overwhelming superiority necessary to crush the remaining traitor resistance and complete the pacification of the Isstvan system. The War Master's plan called for immediate coordination between the two waves, with the fresh forces exploiting the positions established by the first wave to deliver the decisive blow against the enemy. The second wave drop pods began their descent through Isstvan V's atmosphere as scheduled, their approach vectors calculated to bring them down in the rear areas of the traitor positions, where they could establish blocking positions and prevent enemy withdrawal. The sight of thousands of additional Space Marine pods streaking toward the planet's surface should have been a source of encouragement for the first wave forces, who had been fighting for hours to establish and maintain their precarious footholds on the hostile world. The tactical situation appeared to be developing according to plan, with the traitor forces about to face the full might of 7 Space Marine legions in coordinated assault. The moment of betrayal came without warning, as the second wave forces opened fire on their supposed allies rather than the enemy positions they had been deployed to attack. The Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion revealed their true allegiance through coordinated strikes against the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamander's forces that had been fighting to establish the beachheads. The precision and coordination of these attacks demonstrated that the betrayal had been planned from the beginning, with the loyal legions deliberately positioned to maximize their vulnerability to the treacherous assault. The devastating impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. The first wave forces, already weakened by hours of combat against the original traitor positions, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 enemy forces with no avenue for retreat or reinforcement. The Iron Warriors siege specialists turned their expertise against the defensive positions that the loyal forces had established, while the Word Bearers and Night Lords struck at command and communication centers that had been identified during the supposedly cooperative planning phases. The Alpha Legion's infiltration capabilities allowed them to strike at targets throughout the first wave positions, creating confusion and disruption that prevented coordinated responses to the unexpected threat. Corvus Corax realized the full scope of the betrayal within moments of the first treacherous shots being fired. His enhanced senses detected the distinctive signatures of Space Marine weapons being turned against their brothers, while his tactical analysis immediately recognized the coordinated nature of the assault. The Primarch's first priority was the survival of his legion, but the tactical situation offered few options for organized withdrawal. The Raven Guard forces were scattered across multiple positions, engaged with the original enemy forces while simultaneously coming under attack from their former allies. The volcanic terrain that had provided tactical advantages during the initial assault now became a trap, with narrow corridors and limited visibility preventing effective coordination between isolated units. The systematic nature of the massacre that followed demonstrated the extent of the planning that had preceded the betrayal. The traitor forces possessed detailed intelligence about the first wave deployment patterns, communication frequencies, and tactical procedures that could only have been obtained through extensive preparation and coordination with the War Master's staff. Individual Raven Guard units found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed by enemies who knew their positions, capabilities, and likely responses to the unexpected assault. The psychological impact of fighting against former allies added another dimension to the tactical challenges, as Space Marines who had trained and fought alongside their attackers struggled to adapt to the reality of fraternal warfare. The near-complete annihilation of the Raven Guard Legion occurred with horrifying efficiency. Companies that had survived decades of the Great Crusade's most challenging campaigns were destroyed within hours by enemies who understood their tactics and capabilities intimately. The specialized equipment and training that had made the Raven Guard so effective in covert operations provided little advantage against opponents who possessed similar capabilities and superior numbers. The volcanic environment that had been expected to favor the loyal forces instead became a killing ground where isolated units could be eliminated systematically without the possibility of mutual support or coordinated resistance. Corvus Corax fought desperately to rally his surviving forces and organize some form of effective resistance, but the scale of the betrayal and the tactical situation made coordinated action nearly impossible. The Primarch's personal combat capabilities allowed him to carve through enemy forces that would have overwhelmed normal Space Marines, but even his enhanced abilities could not overcome the fundamental disadvantages created by the strategic situation. The realization that the War Master himself had orchestrated the betrayal added a psychological dimension to the physical challenges, as the very foundations of Imperial loyalty and brotherhood were revealed to be corrupted beyond redemption. The survival of any Raven Guard forces from the Isstvan V massacre required desperate measures and extraordinary sacrifices. Small groups of Space Marines fought running battles through the volcanic terrain, using their knowledge of stealth tactics to avoid the systematic sweeps that the traitor forces conducted to eliminate survivors. The harsh environmental conditions that had complicated the initial assault now provided opportunities for concealment, as the volcanic ash and toxic gases created conditions where even enhanced senses were limited in their effectiveness. The survivors who managed to reach extraction points did so only through the sacrifice of their brothers, who sold their lives to buy time for the escape attempts. The escape from Isstvan V marked the end of the Raven Guard as an effective military force and the beginning of Corvus Corax's transformation from a confident military commander into a haunted figure struggling with the implications of the heresy. The Primarch's ability to lead his surviving forces to safety demonstrated his tactical brilliance and personal courage, but the cost of that survival would weigh on him for the remainder of his existence. The philosophical ideals that had guided his approach to warfare and governance were shattered by the reality of betrayal on a scale that challenged his fundamental beliefs about honor, loyalty, and the nature of the Imperium he had served. The devastation of Isstvan V left Corvus Corax with fewer than 3,000 surviving Raven Guard, a catastrophic reduction from the nearly 80,000 Space Marines who had descended upon the volcanic world. The Primarch's return to deliverance brought with it the crushing weight of responsibility for his legion's near extinction and the urgent necessity of rebuilding forces capable of continuing the fight against the traitor legions. The Moon's industrial capacity, enhanced through years of careful development since the liberation, would need to be redirected toward the most ambitious genetic reconstruction project attempted by any loyalist Primarch during the heresy. The Emperor's personal intervention in the Raven Guard's desperate situation came through the arrival of sealed containers bearing the genetic templates and technological apparatus that had been used in the original creation of the Space Marine legions. These materials, transported from the Emperor's laboratories beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, represented the master of mankind's most closely guarded secrets regarding the enhancement of human physiology. The containers held not only the pure gene seed cultures that had been used to create the original legions, but also the sophisticated biotechnological equipment necessary for accelerated cultivation and implantation procedures. The genetic material provided by the Emperor included samples of Corvus Corax's own genetic template, preserved from the original Primarch project and maintained in stasis for nearly 2 centuries. These samples contained the complete genetic information necessary to produce gene seed organs that would carry the full spectrum of Raven Guard enhancements, including the specialized mutations that had been developed specifically for the 19th Legion's operational requirements. The purity of these samples promised to eliminate the genetic degradation that had accumulated over decades of successive implantation cycles, potentially producing Space Marines whose capabilities exceeded even those of the original Legion veterans. The technological apparatus accompanying the genetic material consisted of biocultivation chambers capable of accelerating the normal gene seed maturation process from the standard 5-year cycle to a matter of months. These devices utilized advanced genetic manipulation techniques that could stimulate cellular growth and organ development at rates that would have been impossible using conventional methods. The equipment included automated monitoring systems that could track the development of individual organs and make real-time adjustments to the cultivation parameters to ensure optimal growth conditions. Corvus Corax threw himself into the technical aspects of the project with the same intensity that had characterized his approach to warfare and governance. The Primarch's enhanced intellect allowed him to understand the complex biological processes involved in gene seed cultivation, while his experience with the industrial systems of deliverance provided the organizational framework necessary for scaling up the production to meet the Legion's desperate needs. The conversion of entire manufacturing sectors to support the genetic reconstruction effort required careful coordination between the technical specialists who understood the biological requirements and the industrial workers who would operate the cultivation equipment. The recruitment of suitable candidates for the accelerated enhancement process presented significant challenges, as the compressed timeline eliminated many of the screening procedures that normally identified individuals with the genetic compatibility necessary for successful Space Marine transformation. The standard recruitment protocols required extensive testing over periods of months or years to ensure that candidates possessed the physical and psychological characteristics necessary to survive the enhancement process. The emergency conditions created by the Legion's near destruction demanded the acceptance of higher risk levels in candidate selection, with the understanding that some failures were inevitable given the accelerated timeline. The selection criteria developed for the emergency recruitment program emphasized physical fitness and psychological resilience over the more subtle genetic markers that were normally considered essential for successful enhancement. Candidates were drawn primarily from Deliverance's population, whose exposure to the harsh industrial environment had created a pool of individuals with above-average physical capabilities and stress tolerance. The liberation struggle had also produced a generation of young people who possessed the psychological characteristics necessary for military service, including the ability to function effectively under extreme stress and the motivation to fight for principles larger than individual survival. The first batches of gene seed organs produced using the Emperor's genetic templates showed remarkable promise, developing at unprecedented rates while maintaining the cellular integrity that was essential for successful implantation. The cultivation chambers operated continuously, monitored by teams of technicians who tracked the development of each organ through sophisticated bioscanning equipment. The accelerated growth process required constant adjustment of nutrient solutions and environmental conditions to maintain optimal development rates, while preventing the cellular degradation that could result from excessive growth stimulation. The implantation procedures began within weeks of the first organs reaching maturity, with surgical teams working around the clock to process the steady stream of candidates who had been selected for enhancement. The compressed timeline eliminated the gradual introduction of organs that characterized normal Space Marine creation, instead requiring the simultaneous implantation of multiple organs in procedures that pushed the limits of even enhanced human physiology. The survival rates during these early procedures were lower than normal, but the urgency of the situation demanded acceptance of casualties that would have been unacceptable under normal circumstances. The first generation of new Raven Guard produced through the accelerated process showed physical capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced standards of normal Space Marines. Their strength, speed, and endurance surpassed the measurements recorded for the original Legion members, while their enhanced senses demonstrated acuity that approached the levels achieved by the Primarchs themselves. The psychological conditioning that accompanied the physical enhancement produced individuals who displayed unwavering loyalty to the Emperor and absolute dedication to the destruction of the traitor legions. However, subtle abnormalities began to manifest in the new recruits within months of their enhancement. Physical mutations appeared gradually, starting with minor changes in skin pigmentation and hair growth patterns that seemed insignificant compared to the dramatic improvements in combat capability. The mutations progressed slowly, affecting different individuals in different ways, but following patterns that suggested underlying genetic instability rather than random developmental errors. Medical examinations revealed cellular changes that indicated ongoing genetic drift, with the enhanced DNA showing signs of corruption that had not been present in the original samples. The psychological changes that accompanied the physical mutations were initially dismissed as normal adaptation to the enhanced capabilities and combat training. The new Space Marines displayed levels of aggression and bloodlust that exceeded the controlled violence that characterized normal Astartes behavior. Their tactical thinking became increasingly focused on direct confrontation and overwhelming force, abandoning the subtle approaches that had defined Raven Guard doctrine in favor of brutal efficiency that prioritized enemy destruction over mission objectives. The deterioration of the enhanced recruits accelerated rapidly once the initial mutations became established. Physical deformities appeared with increasing frequency, affecting not only cosmetic characteristics, but also the fundamental biological systems that maintained Space Marine capabilities. Organ failures began occurring in individuals who had initially shown perfect adaptation to their enhancements, while psychological breakdowns manifested as uncontrollable rage and loss of tactical discipline. The careful screening and selection procedures that had identified the most promising candidates proved irrelevant as the genetic corruption spread through the enhanced population regardless of individual fitness or compatibility. The investigation into the source of the genetic corruption revealed evidence of sabotage that had been carefully concealed within the biological materials provided by the Emperor. Microscopic analysis of the gene seed samples showed signs of deliberate contamination with foreign genetic material that had been introduced using techniques sophisticated enough to avoid detection by standard screening procedures. The contamination appeared to have been designed to remain dormant during the initial cultivation and implantation phases, only manifesting after the enhanced individuals had been fully integrated into the Legion's operational structure. The discovery of Alpha Legion infiltrators within Deliverance's technical staff provided the explanation for how the sabotage had been accomplished. These agents had gained access to the cultivation facilities during the early phases of the project, when security procedures were still being established and the focus was on rapid implementation rather than comprehensive screening of personnel. The infiltrators had introduced the contaminating genetic material into the cultivation chambers using methods that mimicked normal maintenance procedures, ensuring that the sabotage would not be detected until the corrupted gene seed had been implanted into hundreds of recruits. The realization that the genetic corruption was irreversible and would continue to spread through the affected population forced Corvus Corax to confront the most difficult decision of his existence. The enhanced recruits who had shown such promise were transforming into grotesque parodies of Space Marines, their enhanced capabilities increasingly overshadowed by physical deformities and psychological instability that made them unsuitable for military service. The corruption was progressive and incurable, meaning that the affected individuals would continue to deteriorate until they became completely incapacitated or posed active threats to their uncontaminated brothers. The psychological impact of the situation on Corvus Corax was devastating, as the Primarch faced the necessity of destroying the very forces he had worked so desperately to create. The enhanced recruits retained enough of their original personalities to understand what was happening to them, creating situations where the Primarch was forced to order the execution of individuals who had volunteered to serve the Emperor and had undergone the enhancement process in good faith. The personal relationships that had developed between the Primarch and his new recruits made each execution a personal tragedy that added to the psychological burden he carried from the losses at Isstvan V. The systematic elimination of the corrupted recruits required careful planning to prevent the spread of panic among the unaffected population of Deliverance. The executions were carried out quietly, with official records indicating that the affected individuals had been transferred to other duties or had died in training accidents. The cultivation facilities were sealed and decontaminated, while the remaining genetic material was destroyed to prevent any possibility of further contamination. The technical staff who had been involved in the project were reassigned or eliminated if they showed signs of being compromised by Alpha Legion infiltration. The failure of the Raptor project marked the end of Corvus Corax's hopes for rapidly rebuilding the Raven Guard to their pre-heresy strength. The few hundred Space Marines who had survived the enhancement process without showing signs of corruption were integrated into the Legion's existing structure, but their numbers were insufficient to restore the 19th Legion to operational effectiveness. The Primarch's dreams of leading a reconstructed force against the traitor legions were replaced by the grim reality of operating with severely limited resources, while carrying the psychological burden of having been forced to destroy his own creations. The long-term implications of the project's failure extended beyond the immediate military consequences to affect Corvus Corax's fundamental understanding of his role within the Imperium and his relationship with his genetic heritage. The corruption of the gene seed samples that had been provided directly by the Emperor raised disturbing questions about the security of the Imperium's most critical biological resources and the extent to which the traitor forces had been able to penetrate Imperial institutions. The successful infiltration of Deliverance by Alpha Legion agents demonstrated that even the most secure Loyalist strongholds were vulnerable to the sophisticated intelligence operations that characterized the enemy's approach to the heresy. The personal cost of the Raptor project's failure would haunt Corvus Corax for the remainder of his involvement in the heresy, adding another layer of guilt and responsibility to the psychological burden he carried from the losses at Isstvan V. The Primarch's decision to destroy the corrupted recruits, while tactically necessary, violated his fundamental principles regarding the protection of those who served under his command. The systematic execution of individuals who had volunteered to serve the Emperor represented a moral compromise that challenged his beliefs about leadership and the responsibilities that came with his enhanced capabilities. The technical knowledge gained from the failed project would prove valuable in future genetic research, but the immediate practical benefits were overshadowed by the human cost of the experimentation. The understanding of gene seed cultivation and enhancement procedures that had been developed during the project provided insights that could be applied to more conventional recruitment and training programs. But the accelerated timeline and experimental techniques that had been necessary for the emergency reconstruction effort could not be safely replicated under normal circumstances. The failure of the Raptor project left Corvus Corax with a drastically diminished legion and a burning need for vengeance against the traitors who had orchestrated the destruction of his sons. The Raven Guard's remaining forces, numbering fewer than 4,000 battle-ready Space Marines, would need to adopt an entirely different approach to warfare if they were to make any meaningful contribution to the Loyalist cause. The conventional military might that had once allowed the 19th Legion to participate in major fleet actions and planetary assaults was gone, replaced by the necessity for surgical strikes and covert operations that could achieve strategic objectives without requiring the massive resources that other loyalist forces could still deploy. The transformation of the Raven Guard's operational doctrine during the Heresy represented a return to the guerrilla warfare principles that had originally shaped Corvus Corax's tactical thinking on deliverance. The small, highly trained units that remained after Isstvan V were ideally suited for infiltration missions and precision strikes against high-value targets throughout the galaxy. Their enhanced capabilities and specialized equipment allowed them to operate independently for extended periods, gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations in ways that conventional Imperial forces could not match. The psychological impact of their reputation for appearing without warning and striking at the heart of traitor operations would prove as valuable as their direct military contributions. The first major operation undertaken by the reconstituted Raven Guard targeted the supply networks that sustained Horus's advance toward Terra. The War Master's forces required massive quantities of materiel to maintain their momentum across multiple fronts, with supply convoys moving through established shipping lanes that connected the traitor-held systems with the front lines of the galactic civil war. These convoys represented vulnerable points in the enemy's logistics network, where small forces could achieve disproportionate effects by eliminating critical shipments of ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment. The Raven Guard's approach to convoy interdiction utilized their enhanced mobility and stealth capabilities to establish ambush positions along the major shipping routes. Teams of Space Marines equipped with modified jump packs could position themselves on asteroids and derelict spacecraft that provided concealment, while offering clear fields of fire against passing vessels. The timing of these attacks was carefully coordinated to maximize confusion among the convoy escorts, with multiple strikes occurring simultaneously across different sectors to prevent the enemy from identifying patterns or implementing effective countermeasures. The psychological warfare component of these operations proved as important as their immediate tactical effects. The systematic destruction of supply convoys created uncertainty and fear among the crews of subsequent shipments, many of whom were civilian contractors or pressed military personnel who lacked the fanatical loyalty that characterized the core traitor forces. Reports of entire convoys disappearing without trace spread throughout the enemy logistics network, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that reduced efficiency and increased the resources required for convoy protection. The intelligence gathered during these raids provided valuable information about enemy troop movements, supply requirements, and strategic planning that was shared with other loyalist forces through secure communication channels. The Raven Guard's ability to intercept enemy communications and capture key personnel during their attacks created opportunities for broader intelligence operations that extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives of individual missions. This information proved crucial for loyalist commanders who were struggling to understand the scope and direction of the traitor force's strategic planning. The disruption of communication networks became another primary objective for Raven Guard operations, as the coordination of the War Master's forces across multiple star systems required sophisticated information management systems that were vulnerable to targeted sabotage. The enemy's reliance on astropathic communication networks created opportunities for surgical strikes against relay stations and communication hubs that could isolate entire sectors from central command. The technical expertise required for these operations drew upon the Raven Guard's experience with the complex industrial systems of deliverance, where understanding of technological infrastructure had been essential for the success of the liberation campaign. The assault on the Corvani's relay station demonstrated the effectiveness of the Raven Guard's new operational approach. This facility, located in the outer reaches of the Corvani's system, served as a critical communication hub for traitor forces operating in 3 adjacent sectors. The station's orbital position and heavily automated defenses made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault, but the Raven Guard's infiltration capabilities allowed them to insert small teams directly into the facility's interior through maintenance access points and cargo transfer systems. The systematic destruction of the station's communication equipment was accomplished through carefully placed demolition charges that created cascading failures throughout the facility's technical infrastructure. The Raven Guard teams had studied the station's operational procedures for weeks before the assault, identifying the critical nodes whose destruction would cause maximum disruption to the communication network. The timing of the demolitions was coordinated to prevent the facility's automated systems from implementing damage control measures that might have preserved partial functionality. The loss of the Corvani's relay station severed communication links between traitor forces in the affected sectors for several weeks, creating opportunities for loyalist forces to exploit the resulting confusion and coordination failures. Enemy units that had been operating in close coordination suddenly found themselves isolated and unable to respond effectively to changing tactical situations. The psychological impact of the attack extended beyond its immediate effects, as other communication facilities implemented enhanced security measures that reduced their operational efficiency and diverted resources from combat operations. The collaboration between the Raven Guard and loyalist resistance movements throughout the galaxy created force multiplication effects that extended the Legion's limited resources across a much broader operational area. The Primarch's experience with underground resistance networks on Deliverance provided valuable insights into the organization and support of civilian populations who opposed traitor rule. These relationships allowed the Raven Guard to establish safe houses, supply caches, and intelligence networks in systems that were nominally under enemy control, but contained significant populations who remained loyal to the Emperor. The support provided to resistance movements went beyond simple military assistance to include training in guerrilla warfare techniques and the provision of specialized equipment that enhanced the effectiveness of civilian fighters. The Raven Guard's technical specialists worked with local populations to develop improvised weapons and communication systems using materials that were readily available in industrial environments. These innovations allowed resistance groups to conduct more sophisticated operations while maintaining the security necessary to avoid detection by enemy occupation forces. The psychological warfare campaign that accompanied these operations focused on undermining the morale and cohesion of traitor forces through systematic demonstration that their control was neither absolute nor secure. The appearance of Raven Guard strike forces in systems that were supposedly pacified created doubt about the effectiveness of traitor security measures and encouraged resistance activities among populations that might otherwise have remained passive. The reputation of the Raven Guard as liberators who protected civilian populations from oppression resonated with communities that had experienced the brutal occupation policies implemented by some traitor legions. The coordination of these diverse operations required sophisticated command and control systems that could maintain communication with widely dispersed forces while preserving operational security. The Raven Guard developed encrypted communication protocols that utilized existing Imperial communication networks without revealing their true nature or origin. These systems allowed Corvus Corax to coordinate operations across multiple star systems while maintaining the security necessary to prevent enemy intelligence services from identifying and targeting key personnel or facilities. The integration of intelligence gathering with direct action missions created synergistic effects that enhanced the value of both types of operations. Raven Guard teams conducting sabotage missions could simultaneously collect information about enemy capabilities and intentions, while intelligence operations provided the targeting data necessary for effective strikes against high-value objectives. This integration required careful training and equipment selection to ensure that personnel could accomplish both objectives without compromising either mission component. The development of specialized equipment for these operations drew upon the technical expertise that had been accumulated during the Raptor project, applying the lessons learned from that failed experiment to more conventional military applications. Enhanced communication equipment allowed small teams to maintain contact across interstellar distances, while improved stealth systems reduced the likelihood of detection during infiltration missions. The modification of standard Space Marine equipment to support extended independent operations required careful balancing of capability enhancement against the weight and power requirements that could compromise mobility and stealth characteristics. The recruitment of new personnel for these operations required different criteria than the standard Space Marine selection process, as the Raven Guard needed individuals who could operate effectively in isolation while maintaining the psychological stability necessary for extended covert operations. The surviving veterans of Isstvan V provided the core leadership for these activities, but the expansion of operations required the integration of personnel from other sources, including loyalist survivors from other legions and specially selected individuals from Imperial Guard units that had demonstrated exceptional capability in reconnaissance and special operations roles. The training programs developed for these mixed units emphasized the unique requirements of covert warfare while building upon the enhanced capabilities that all participants brought to the operations. The integration of Space Marines with baseline human personnel required careful attention to the different physical and psychological characteristics of the various participants, while the operational security requirements demanded strict compartmentalization of information and careful screening of all personnel involved in sensitive activities. The establishment of forward operating bases in contested systems provided the logistical support necessary for sustained operations, while maintaining the security required to avoid detection by enemy forces. These facilities were typically located in asteroid fields or on uninhabited worlds that offered concealment, while providing access to the shipping lanes and communication networks that were primary targets for Raven Guard operations. The construction and maintenance of these bases required significant resources and careful coordination with loyalist supply networks, but their strategic value justified the investment in terms of operational effectiveness and force multiplication. The psychological impact of the Raven Guard's operations on Corvus Corax himself was complex, as the success of these missions provided some measure of redemption for the failures at Isstvan V and during the Raptor project, while the nature of the warfare required constant confrontation with the moral ambiguities that characterized the galactic civil war. The Primarch's direct involvement in many of these operations allowed him to maintain personal connections with his surviving sons while demonstrating the leadership that had originally inspired their loyalty. However, the constant exposure to the brutality and betrayal that defined the heresy continued to erode his faith in the idealistic principles that had once guided his approach to warfare and governance. The recognition of the Raven Guard's contributions by other loyalist commanders provided validation for their specialized approach to warfare, while the intelligence and operational support they provided enhanced the effectiveness of larger loyalist forces throughout the galaxy. The reputation they earned as the Deliverer among oppressed populations reflected their success in combining military effectiveness with humanitarian concerns, maintaining the principles that had originally defined their approach to warfare even under the extreme conditions of the heresy. As the traitor fleets began their inexorable advance toward the Sol system, Corvus Corax found himself summoned to Terra for what would become the final confrontation between the Emperor's vision and the War Master's rebellion. The journey to Terra brought the Raven Guard through star systems that bore the scars of 7 years of galactic civil war. Entire worlds had been reduced to ash and bone, their populations either slaughtered or enslaved by the advancing traitor forces. The industrial capacity that had once sustained the Great Crusade's expansion now served the War Master's war machine, producing weapons and equipment that would be turned against the very worlds that had created them. The sight of these devastated systems reinforced Corvus Corax's understanding that the conflict had moved far beyond the political disagreements that had initially driven some Primarchs to rebellion, evolving into a struggle for the fundamental nature of human civilization. The Sol system itself had been transformed into the greatest fortress in human history, with defensive installations spanning from the outer gas giants to the inner worlds. The Imperial Fists had spent years preparing Terra's defenses under Rogaldorn's meticulous supervision, creating overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The orbital platforms that protected the approaches to Terra bristled with weapons capable of destroying entire fleets, while the planet's surface had been fortified with defensive works that dwarfed anything constructed during the Great Crusade. The Raven Guard's arrival at Terra coincided with the final preparations for the siege, as loyalist forces from across the galaxy converged on humanity's birthworld for the ultimate confrontation. The Legion's depleted numbers meant they could not contribute significantly to the massive defensive preparations that characterized the Imperial Fist's approach to the coming battle. Instead, Corvus Corax met with the other loyalist Primarchs to discuss how his forces could best serve the defense of the Imperial Palace and the Emperor's person. The strategic situation on Terra presented unique challenges that differed significantly from the conventional warfare that had characterized most of the Heresy's major battles. The planet's urban environment, with its countless hive cities and industrial complexes, created a three-dimensional battlefield where traditional tactics would prove inadequate. The massive scale of the Imperial Palace complex, covering most of the former Himalayan mountain range, required defensive strategies that could protect multiple critical points simultaneously while maintaining communication and coordination between widely separated units. Rogaldorn's defensive plan allocated the Raven Guard to reconnaissance and rapid response missions that would exploit their mobility and stealth capabilities. The Legion's surviving forces would be distributed throughout the palace complex, positioned to provide early warning of enemy infiltration attempts while maintaining the flexibility to respond quickly to breakthrough attempts at any point along the defensive perimeter. Their experience with urban warfare and close-quarters combat made them ideally suited for the type of fighting that would characterize the siege's later phases, when the battle would inevitably move into the palace's interior corridors and chambers. The modification of the Imperial Palace's defensive systems to accommodate the Raven Guard's operational requirements involved the installation of concealed observation posts and communication nodes throughout the complex. These positions were carefully integrated into the existing architecture to avoid compromising the structural integrity of the defensive works, while providing the surveillance capabilities necessary for effective intelligence gathering. The technical expertise developed during the Legion's operations on Deliverance proved valuable in adapting the palace's ancient systems to support modern military communications and sensor equipment. The arrival of the traitor fleets in the Sol system marked the beginning of the siege that would determine the fate of the Imperium. The massive armada assembled by the Warmaster represented the combined might of 9 Space Marine legions, supported by countless auxiliary forces and the dark powers that had been unleashed through their pacts with chaos. The sheer scale of the attacking force dwarfed anything that had been seen during the Great Crusade, with thousands of capital ships and millions of assault troops prepared to overwhelm Terra's defenses through brute force and overwhelming numbers. The initial phases of the siege focused on the systematic destruction of Terra's orbital defenses, as the traitor fleets engaged the loyalist naval forces in void battles that raged across the entire Sol system. The Raven Guard's limited naval assets could contribute little to these massive engagements, but their reconnaissance capabilities provided valuable intelligence about enemy fleet movements and tactical intentions. Small teams of Space Marines equipped with specialized sensors and communication equipment were positioned throughout the system's asteroid fields and outer planets, where they could observe enemy operations without detection. The intelligence gathered by these observation posts revealed the sophisticated nature of the traitor force's assault plan, which involved multiple coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm different aspects of Terra's defensive network simultaneously. The War Master's forces were not simply attempting to batter their way through the Loyalist defenses, but were implementing a complex strategy that exploited specific vulnerabilities in the Imperial Palace's defensive arrangements. This information proved crucial for the Loyalist commanders, who were able to adjust their defensive positions and resource allocation to counter the most dangerous aspects of the enemy's approach. The first direct assault on the Imperial Palace began with massive orbital bombardments that targeted the outer defensive works while avoiding the palace itself, as the traitor forces understood that their ultimate objective required the capture rather than the destruction of the Emperor's seat of power. The bombardment created breaches in the defensive perimeter that allowed traitor ground forces to establish beachheads on Terra's surface, beginning the phase of the siege that would test every aspect of the Loyalist forces' preparation and resolve. Corvus Corax led his forces in a series of reconnaissance missions that penetrated deep into the enemy-held areas around the Imperial Palace, gathering intelligence about traitor troop dispositions and defensive preparations. These operations required the Raven Guard to move through urban environments that had been transformed into battlefields, where every building and street could conceal enemy forces or booby traps. The Legion's experience with urban warfare and their enhanced senses allowed them to navigate these hazardous conditions while avoiding the major enemy concentrations that would have overwhelmed their limited numbers. The information gathered during these reconnaissance missions revealed that the traitor forces were implementing a systematic approach to the siege that involved the gradual encirclement of the Imperial Palace while maintaining pressure on multiple fronts. The enemy commanders understood that a direct assault on the palace's main defenses would result in catastrophic casualties, instead choosing to establish forward positions that could support a sustained siege while preventing Loyalist forces from receiving reinforcements or supplies from outside the palace complex. The Raven Guard's response to this strategy involved a series of surgical strikes against key enemy positions that disrupted the traitor forces' coordination and supply lines. Small teams of Space Marines equipped with demolition charges and specialized weapons targeted command posts, ammunition depots, and communication centers throughout the enemy-held areas. These attacks were carefully timed to create maximum confusion among the traitor forces while avoiding the sustained engagement that would have resulted in the destruction of the attacking units. The psychological impact of these operations on the traitor forces proved significant, as the systematic destruction of supposedly secure positions created uncertainty and paranoia among enemy commanders who had expected to face conventional defensive warfare. The reputation of the Raven Guard for appearing without warning and striking at the heart of enemy positions had preceded them to Terra, creating an atmosphere of fear that reduced the effectiveness of traitor operations, even when the direct military impact of individual strikes was limited. The defense of the Eternity Gate represented one of the most critical phases of the siege, as this massive portal provided the primary access point to the innermost sections of the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor maintained his personal chambers and the Golden Throne. The gate's defensive systems had been enhanced with the most advanced weapons and detection equipment available to the Imperium, but the scale of the traitor assault threatened to overwhelm even these formidable defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Corvus Corax positioned elements of the Raven Guard in concealed positions throughout the approaches to the Eternity Gate, where they could provide early warning of enemy assault preparations, while maintaining the ability to strike at critical moments during the battle. The Legion snipers, equipped with specialized long-range weapons, were positioned to eliminate key enemy personnel and disrupt coordinated attacks before they could develop momentum. The careful positioning of these forces required detailed knowledge of the battlefield terrain and enemy tactical preferences, information that had been gathered through weeks of reconnaissance and observation. The assault on the Eternity Gate began with a massive artillery bombardment that targeted the gate's defensive positions while attempting to create breaches in the surrounding walls. The traitor forces had concentrated their most powerful siege weapons for this attack, including Titan-class war machines and orbital bombardment platforms that could deliver devastating firepower against even the most heavily fortified positions. The scale of the bombardment created conditions that challenged the survival of any forces positioned in the target area, requiring the Raven Guard to utilize their most advanced stealth and protection equipment. The direct combat that followed the initial bombardment tested every aspect of the Raven Guard's training and equipment as they engaged traitor Space Marines in close quarters fighting throughout the gate complex. The confined spaces and limited visibility created by the bombardment damage favored the Legion's specialized combat techniques, allowing them to utilize their enhanced senses and mobility to gain advantages over enemies who possessed superior numbers and firepower. The fighting was brutal and sustained, with individual battles lasting for hours as small groups of Space Marines contested control of critical positions within the defensive network. Corvus Corax's personal participation in the defense of the Eternity Gate demonstrated the combat capabilities that had made him legendary among his brother Primarchs. The Raven Lord moved through the battlefield like a shadow given form, appearing without warning to strike down enemy champions and commanders before disappearing back into the chaos of battle. His twin lightning claws, mercy and deliverance, carved through traitor Space Marines with surgical precision, while his enhanced speed and agility allowed him to avoid the concentrated fire that would have destroyed lesser warriors. The climactic moment of the Eternity Gate's defense came when a breakthrough by traitor forces threatened to overwhelm the Loyalist positions and open the way to the palace's interior. Corvus Corax led a desperate counterattack that utilized every surviving member of the Raven Guard in a coordinated assault against the enemy spearhead. The attack combined the Legion's signature stealth tactics with conventional Space Marine assault techniques, creating a devastating strike that eliminated the traitor breakthrough force and restored the defensive line. The personal cost of this victory was significant, as the Raven Guard suffered casualties that further reduced their already depleted numbers. Many of the Legion's veteran sergeants and specialists who had survived Isstvan V and the subsequent guerrilla campaigns fell during the defense of the Eternity Gate, their sacrifice buying time for the broader Loyalist defense, but leaving the Legion with even fewer experienced personnel. The psychological impact of these losses on Corvus Corax was profound, as each fallen Space Marine represented not only a tactical asset, but also a personal connection to the ideals and principles that had originally motivated his service to the Emperor. The Emperor's confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's flagship marked the climax of the siege, as the two most powerful beings in human history engaged in single combat that would determine the fate of the species. The psychic emanations from this battle were felt throughout the Sol system, creating disturbances in the warp that affected astropathic communications and caused widespread panic among both Loyalist and traitor forces. The outcome of the confrontation remained uncertain for hours, as the Emperor's loyal sons waited for word of their father's fate while continuing to fight against the traitor forces that still threatened Terra's defenses. The news of the Emperor's victory and Horus's death reached the defenders of the Imperial Palace through fragmentary reports and psychic impressions rather than formal communications. The immediate collapse of traitor morale following the War Master's defeat created opportunities for Loyalist counterattacks that drove the remaining enemy forces away from the palace complex. However, the Emperor's grievous injuries and his subsequent internment in the Golden Throne cast a shadow over the victory that would fundamentally alter the nature of the Imperium and its relationship with its founder. The aftermath of the siege found Corvus Corax struggling to comprehend the full implications of the Emperor's condition and the changes that would inevitably follow. The Master of Mankind's placement on the Golden Throne represented both a victory over the forces of chaos and a tragic transformation of the being who had created the Primarchs and guided the Great Crusade. The Emperor's ability to communicate with his sons was severely limited by his need to maintain the psychic barriers that protected Terra from demonic incursion, creating a sense of isolation and abandonment among the surviving Primarchs. The establishment of the High Lords of Terra as the Imperium's governing body represented a fundamental shift away from the direct imperial rule that had characterized the Great Crusade era. The bureaucratic structures that emerged to manage the Imperium's vast territories and resources bore little resemblance to the idealistic vision of human unity that had originally motivated the conquest of the galaxy. The emphasis on rigid hierarchy, religious orthodoxy, and systematic oppression of deviation from approved norms conflicted directly with the principles of liberation and just governance that had shaped Corvus Corax's approach to leadership. The transformation of the imperial truth into the imperial cult represented another source of disillusionment for the Raven Lord, as the rational, scientific worldview that had guided the Great Crusade gave way to religious fanaticism and superstition. The deification of the emperor, despite his explicit rejection of such worship during his active reign, created a theological framework that justified the very types of oppression and authoritarianism that Corvus Corax had spent his life fighting against. The systematic suppression of knowledge and independent thought that characterized the emerging imperial orthodoxy violated the educational and cultural principles that had been central to Deliverance's transformation. The Raven Guard's role in the post-heresy Imperium reflected these broader changes, as the Legion was expected to serve as enforcers of imperial will rather than liberators of oppressed populations. The specialized skills and equipment that had made them effective during the heresy were increasingly directed toward the suppression of internal dissent and the elimination of threats to imperial authority. The moral ambiguity of these missions conflicted with the principles that had originally motivated many of the Legion's members, creating tensions within the unit that reflected the broader contradictions of the emerging imperial system. The gradual recognition that the Imperium was evolving into the type of oppressive regime that he had originally fought against created a profound crisis of faith for Corvus Corax. The idealistic vision of human liberation and just governance that had motivated his service to the Emperor seemed increasingly irrelevant in a galaxy where survival required the systematic suppression of the very freedoms that had once been considered fundamental rights. The Primarch's growing disillusionment with the Imperium's direction would eventually lead to his withdrawal from active service and his eventual departure from the material universe, but the seeds of that decision were planted during the immediate aftermath of the siege, when the true nature of the post-heresy Imperium began to emerge. The transformation of the Imperium in the wake of the Horus Heresy created an environment that grew increasingly incompatible with the principles that had shaped Corvus Corax throughout his existence. The bureaucratic apparatus that emerged to govern humanity's scattered worlds bore little resemblance to the democratic councils that had flourished on Deliverance under his guidance. The High Lords of Terra implemented policies that prioritized control and compliance over the individual freedoms that the Primarch had fought to establish. Administrative efficiency became the paramount concern, with human dignity and personal autonomy relegated to secondary considerations that could be sacrificed whenever they conflicted with imperial necessity. The systematic persecution of knowledge and independent thought that characterized the emerging imperial orthodoxy represented a fundamental betrayal of the educational principles that had been central to Deliverance's transformation. The libraries and technical schools that had been established to empower the moon's population with understanding of their industrial systems were viewed with suspicion by imperial authorities who preferred ignorant compliance to informed participation. The suppression of scientific inquiry and philosophical debate created conditions that resembled the intellectual oppression that had characterized the Tech Guild regime, albeit implemented through different mechanisms and justified by different ideologies. The Raven Guard's missions during the early years of the post-heresy period increasingly involved the suppression of populations that had committed no crimes beyond seeking the same freedoms that Corvus Corax had once fought to establish. Planetary governors who attempted to implement democratic reforms found themselves classified as seditious elements requiring elimination, while civilian populations that resisted imperial taxation and conscription policies were designated as rebellion threats that needed to be crushed through military force. The Legion's specialized capabilities in infiltration and precision strikes made them particularly effective at eliminating resistance leadership, but the moral implications of these operations created growing tensions within the unit's command structure. The transformation of the Imperial Truth into the Imperial Cult represented another source of profound disillusionment for the Primarch, as the rational worldview that had guided the Great Crusade gave way to religious fanaticism that demanded absolute faith rather than understanding. The deification of the Emperor, despite his explicit rejection of such worship during his active reign, created a theological framework that justified the suppression of dissent and the persecution of anyone who questioned established doctrine. The ecclesiarchy's growing influence over imperial policy ensured that scientific inquiry and philosophical debate would be increasingly subordinated to religious orthodoxy, creating conditions that stifled the intellectual development that Corvus Corax considered essential for human progress. The Primarch's attempts to maintain the principles that had originally motivated his service to the Emperor became increasingly difficult as the Imperium's policies grew more authoritarian and oppressive. His efforts to minimize civilian casualties during compliance operations were viewed as inefficiency by Imperial commanders who preferred overwhelming force to surgical precision. His insistence on establishing just governance in conquered territories was seen as an unnecessary complication that slowed the process of resource extraction and tribute collection. The humanitarian concerns that had once been considered noble aspects of his leadership were reframed as weaknesses that compromised military effectiveness and imperial security. The gradual erosion of the ideals that had defined the Great Crusade created a profound sense of betrayal that affected not only Corvus Corax, but many of the surviving Space Marines who had served during the earlier period. Veterans who had joined the legions to liberate humanity from oppression found themselves enforcing the very types of tyranny they had originally fought against. The cognitive dissonance between their original mission and their current duties created psychological stress that manifested in various forms of dysfunction, from increased aggression to withdrawal from active service. The Raven Guard's emphasis on individual initiative and moral reasoning made them particularly susceptible to these conflicts, as their training encouraged them to evaluate the ethical implications of their actions rather than simply following orders without question. The investigation into the Raptor Project's sabotage had revealed the extent to which the Alpha Legion had penetrated Imperial institutions, but the broader implications of this infiltration remained largely unaddressed by Imperial authorities. The systematic corruption of critical biological resources demonstrated that the enemy possessed capabilities that threatened the fundamental security of the Imperium's military forces, yet the response focused on immediate damage control rather than comprehensive security reforms. The failure to implement adequate safeguards against future infiltration attempts reflected the bureaucratic inertia that characterized the post-heresy imperial administration, where political concerns often took precedence over practical security requirements. The psychological impact of the Raptor Project's failure continued to haunt Corvus Corax years after the corrupted recruits had been eliminated. The memory of ordering the execution of Space Marines who had volunteered to serve the Emperor represented a moral compromise that challenged his fundamental beliefs about leadership and responsibility. The knowledge that these individuals had been transformed into grotesque parodies of their intended forms through enemy sabotage provided little comfort, as the Primarch understood that his decisions had ultimately determined their fate regardless of the circumstances that had created the situation. The isolation that characterized Corvus Corax's position among his surviving brother Primarchs reflected the growing divergence between his philosophical approach and the pragmatic authoritarianism that dominated imperial policy. Primarchs who had adapted to the post-heresy environment by embracing the systematic application of overwhelming force viewed his continued emphasis on precision and restraint as outdated idealism that failed to address the harsh realities of governing a galaxy spanning empire. The debates that had once characterized discussions between the Emperor's sons about appropriate levels of force and civilian protection became increasingly rare, as most Primarchs focused on the practical requirements of maintaining imperial control rather than the ethical implications of their methods. The Raven Guard's declining effectiveness as a conventional military force reflected both their reduced numbers and the changing nature of imperial warfare. The Legion's specialization in covert operations and precision strikes made them valuable for specific types of missions, but their inability to participate in large-scale conventional operations limited their strategic importance. The emphasis on massed formations and overwhelming firepower that characterized post-heresy imperial doctrine left little room for the subtle approaches that had once made the Raven Guard so effective. The Legion's unique capabilities were increasingly viewed as exotic specializations rather than essential military assets, reducing their influence within imperial command structures. The establishment of the Codex Astartes as the standard organizational framework for Space Marine forces represented another challenge to the Raven Guard's distinctive identity. The systematic reforms implemented by Robute Guilliman emphasized standardization and interoperability over the specialized capabilities that had developed within individual legions during the Great Crusade. The requirement to divide the Raven Guard into smaller chapters and adopt standardized equipment and tactics threatened to eliminate the unique characteristics that had made the Legion effective in its specialized role. The tension between compliance with imperial regulations and preservation of tactical effectiveness created ongoing conflicts within the Legion's command structure. The decision to maintain the Raven Guard's specialized capabilities despite pressure for standardization reflected Corvus Corax's determination to preserve the principles that had originally shaped his approach to warfare. The Legion's training programs continued to emphasize stealth, precision, and individual initiative, even as other Imperial forces adopted more conventional approaches. The specialized equipment and tactics that had been developed during the Heresy were maintained and refined, ensuring that the Raven Guard retained their unique capabilities even as their strategic importance diminished within the broader Imperial military structure. The growing disconnect between Corvus Corax's idealistic vision and the authoritarian reality of the post-Heresy Imperium created a psychological burden that affected every aspect of his existence. The Primarch's enhanced cognitive abilities allowed him to perceive the long-term implications of imperial policies with clarity that made their moral compromises even more troubling. His understanding of the historical patterns that had led to the rise and fall of previous human civilizations provided context that made the Imperium's current trajectory appear both predictable and tragic. The knowledge that his continued service was contributing to the establishment of the very types of oppressive systems he had originally fought against created a moral crisis that could not be resolved through conventional means. The increasing frequency of Corvus Corax's visits to Deliverance reflected his need to maintain connection with the principles and communities that had originally shaped his character. The Moon's population continued to operate according to the democratic principles that had been established during the Liberation, but their autonomy was increasingly constrained by imperial regulations and oversight. The industrial systems that had once served the needs of the local population were gradually integrated into the broader imperial war machine, with production priorities determined by distant bureaucrats rather than local councils. The transformation of Deliverance from a model of just governance into another imperial resource extraction facility represented a microcosm of the broader changes affecting the entire Imperium. The Primarch's growing preoccupation with the philosophical implications of his situation began to affect his military effectiveness and his relationships with his surviving sons. The Space Marines who had served under his command during the Heresy noticed changes in his demeanor and decision-making processes that suggested deep psychological distress. His tendency to question orders and seek alternatives to violent solutions, while consistent with his historical approach, became more pronounced and began to interfere with mission execution. The moral complexity that had once enhanced his tactical thinking now seemed to paralyze his ability to make decisive choices in situations that required immediate action. The investigation into the nature of the warp energies that had been unleashed during the Horus Heresy revealed disturbing information about the fundamental forces that shaped reality within the galaxy. The chaos powers that had corrupted the traitor legions represented threats that transcended conventional military opposition, requiring responses that challenged the rational worldview that had guided imperial policy during the Great Crusade. The systematic study of these forces revealed that the enemy possessed capabilities that could corrupt even the most loyal servants of the Emperor, creating security challenges that could not be addressed through conventional military or administrative measures. The realization that the war against chaos would require eternal vigilance and constant sacrifice created a strategic framework that justified the authoritarian policies that Corvus Corax found so troubling. The argument that individual freedoms and democratic governance were luxuries that humanity could not afford in the face of existential threats to its survival provided a rational basis for the systematic oppression that characterized imperial rule. The Primarch's understanding of these arguments did not make them more palatable, but it did provide context for the decisions that his brother Primarchs and imperial administrators had made in response to the post-heresy security environment. The discovery of ancient texts and archaeological evidence that revealed the cyclical nature of human civilizations' rise and fall provided additional context for the Imperium's current trajectory. The patterns that had characterized previous human empires suggested that the concentration of power and the suppression of individual initiative that marked imperial policy were natural responses to the challenges of governing galactic-scale civilizations. However, the same historical evidence also indicated that these approaches ultimately led to stagnation and decline, creating conditions that made civilizations vulnerable to the very threats they had been designed to address. The philosophical framework that emerged from Corvus Corax's study of these historical patterns suggested that the Imperium's current approach, while potentially effective in the short term, was ultimately unsustainable. The systematic suppression of innovation and independent thought would eventually create conditions where humanity would be unable to adapt to new challenges or threats. The concentration of power in centralized bureaucratic structures would create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood the system's weaknesses. The emphasis on compliance and conformity would eliminate the diversity of thought and approach that had originally made humanity successful in its expansion across the galaxy. The growing certainty that the Imperium was following a path that would ultimately lead to stagnation and decline created a sense of futility that affected every aspect of Corvus Corax's existence. His continued service to an institution that he believed was fundamentally flawed seemed increasingly pointless, while his attempts to influence imperial policy from within had proven largely ineffective. The bureaucratic inertia that characterized the post-heresy administration made meaningful reform extremely difficult, while the security concerns that dominated imperial thinking provided justification for maintaining the status quo regardless of its long-term consequences. The psychological burden of these realizations, combined with the accumulated trauma from Isstvan V, the Raptor Project, and years of morally ambiguous missions, began to manifest in ways that affected Corvus Corax's physical and mental health. The Primarch's enhanced physiology had always allowed him to recover from injuries and stress that would have incapacitated normal humans, but the psychological damage from his experiences proved more difficult to address through conventional means. The isolation that resulted from his growing disillusionment with imperial policies created additional stress that compounded the existing psychological burden. The decision to withdraw from active service and seek alternative approaches to serving humanity's interests represented a fundamental shift in Corvus Corax's understanding of his role and responsibilities. The Primarch's conclusion that his continued participation in imperial military operations was contributing to the establishment of oppressive systems that would ultimately harm humanity, required him to find new ways to fulfill his obligations to the Emperor and to the principles that had originally motivated his service. The search for alternatives to conventional military service led him to explore approaches that had not been considered during the Great Crusade or the Heresy. The investigation into the nature of the warp and the forces that operated within it revealed possibilities for action that transcended the limitations of conventional military operations. The enemy's use of warp-based capabilities suggested that effective opposition might require similar approaches, while the Emperor's own relationship with psychic forces provided precedent for the exploration of alternatives to purely physical intervention. The Primarch's enhanced cognitive abilities and his experience with the subtle aspects of warfare made him particularly suited for operations that required understanding of complex interdimensional phenomena. The transformation that began to affect Corvus Corax during his final years of Imperial service reflected both his growing mastery of warp-based capabilities and the psychological changes that resulted from his disillusionment with the Imperium's direction. The Primarch's physical form began to exhibit characteristics that suggested increasing integration with warp energies, while his mental processes showed signs of expansion beyond the limitations that had previously constrained his thinking. These changes were gradual and subtle, but they represented a fundamental shift in his nature that would ultimately enable him to pursue objectives that were impossible for purely physical beings. The decision to abandon the Imperium and pursue the traitor Primarchs into the Eye of Terror represented the culmination of Corvus Corax's transformation from a conventional military commander into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The Primarch's understanding that the war against chaos could not be won through conventional means led him to embrace approaches that transcended the limitations of physical reality. His growing mastery of warp energies allowed him to operate in environments that would have been lethal to normal space marines, while his enhanced cognitive abilities enabled him to understand and manipulate the complex forces that shaped reality within the Eye of Terror. The transformation into a being of shadow and warp energy marked Corvus Corax's final evolution from his original form as a genetically enhanced human into something that existed partially outside the normal constraints of physical reality. This change was not sudden, but occurred gradually over a period of years, as the Primarch's mastery of warp-based capabilities increased and his psychological integration with these forces deepened. The process was irreversible and represented a fundamental alteration in his nature that would affect every aspect of his existence for the remainder of his conscious existence. The hunt for Lorgar and the word-bearers within the warp became the primary focus of Corvus Corax's existence after his departure from the Imperium. The Primarch's desire for vengeance against the architect of the Isstvan V betrayal provided the emotional energy necessary to sustain his transformation and maintain his sense of purpose despite the isolation and psychological stress that characterized existence within the Eye of Terror. The pursuit of the word-bearers required capabilities that exceeded those of conventional military forces, as the enemy had established themselves within demon worlds where the normal laws of physics did not apply, and where reality itself could be manipulated by those with sufficient understanding of warp-based phenomena. The current status of Corvus Corax as a legendary figure stalking the demon worlds represents the culmination of his transformation from a liberator of oppressed populations into an agent of vengeance operating outside the normal constraints of physical reality. His ultimate fate remains unknown to the Imperium, as the nature of his existence within the Eye of Terror makes conventional communication and observation impossible. The reports that occasionally reach Imperial authorities describe encounters with a shadow-wreathed figure that appears without warning to eliminate word-bearers and other traitor forces. But the reliability of these accounts is questionable given the distorting effects of warp exposure on human perception and memory. The legacy of Corvus Corax within the Imperium reflects both his contributions to the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy and the tragic circumstances that led to his departure from conventional service. The Raven Guard continue to operate according to the principles and tactics that he established, maintaining their specialization in covert operations and precision strikes while adapting to the changing requirements of imperial warfare. The idealistic vision of human liberation that originally motivated the Primarch service has been largely abandoned by the post-heresy Imperium, but echoes of his influence can still be detected in the humanitarian concerns that occasionally surface within imperial military doctrine. The philosophical questions raised by Corvus Corax's transformation and departure continue to challenge imperial thinkers who attempt to understand the relationship between individual conscience and institutional loyalty. His decision to abandon the Imperium in pursuit of personal vengeance represents either a tragic failure of duty or a principled rejection of an institution that had betrayed its original ideals, depending on one's perspective regarding the nature of loyalty and moral obligation. The ambiguity of his current status reflects the broader moral complexities that characterize the post-heresy Imperium, where survival often requires compromises that challenge the fundamental principles that originally justified human expansion across the galaxy. The Raven Lord's story serves as both inspiration and warning for those who would serve the Emperor's vision while maintaining their moral integrity in a galaxy where such principles are increasingly viewed as dangerous luxuries. His transformation from idealistic liberator to vengeful shadow demonstrates the psychological costs of prolonged exposure to the moral compromises that characterize warfare against chaos, while his ultimate departure from imperial service illustrates the tragic consequences when individual conscience conflicts irreconcilably with institutional demands. The legend of Corvus Corax endures as a reminder of both the heights of heroism that humanity can achieve and the depths of despair that await those who lose faith in the causes they once served with absolute dedication.